I was the most powerful man in Boston. She could barely afford her electricity bill. On a stormy Friday night, fate did something neither of them asked for. It put a billionaire CEO on the doorstep of a broken-down apartment in one of the city's most forgotten neighborhoods, holding a laptop that wasn't his, standing in the rain like a man who had nowhere else to be. What happened next would destroy everything he thought he'd buried, and give her everything she never believed she deserved. This is their story. If this is your kind of story, stay until the end. Hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down hard that evening, not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that makes people feel romantic or nostalgic. This was a cold, relentless October storm that flooded the gutters on Meridian Street, knocked trash cans off sidewalks in South Boston, and forced the kind of people who had somewhere warm to go. To run. The kind of people who didn't have somewhere warm, they just got wet. Ava Bennett was running. She had her coat pulled over her head, her sneakers already soaked through from a puddle she'd misjudged at the corner of Washington and Fifth, and she was muttering something under her breath that was equal parts prayer and profanity. The bus stop was half a block away. She could see it. She could practically feel the plastic shelter over her head already. And then her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again and again. She stopped under the narrow awning of a closed laundromat, water dripping from her hair into her eyes, and looked at the screen. 3 messages. Marcus Chen, head of executive operations, Sinclair Global. Her stomach dropped before she even read the first word. Ava, the presentation files. Did you take the laptop home? She spun around immediately, not even fully understanding why, like her body already knew the answer before her brain caught up. Her bag. She unzipped it right there in the rain, her fingers shaking, going through every pocket with the kind of desperate focus you only get when something catastrophic is about to happen, and you are powerless to stop it. No laptop. Her hand pressed flat against the bottom of her bag, feeling nothing but her wallet, a granola bar, and the broken zipper pouch she kept meaning to fix. No laptop. No. She'd left it on her desk. The laptop with the entire Morrison Klein investor presentation on it. 4 weeks of work, 72 slides, financial projections she'd rebuilt from scratch after the original analyst quit mid-project. The presentation that was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. in front of a room full of people who did not care about weather or personal hardship or the fact that she'd been pulling 12-hour days since the beginning of the month. She typed back fast, fingers slipping on the wet screen. I'll go back. I'm sorry. I'll get it. Marcus replied in under 10 seconds. You can't. Building's locked down. After-hour security protocols changed last week. You'd need a senior keycard to get back in. We're trying to reach someone now. Ava stood there in the rain. Just stood there. The bus she'd been running toward came and went with a hydraulic hiss, its lights disappearing around the corner. She didn't even look at it. 40 minutes earlier, on the 42nd floor of the Sinclair Global building, Ethan Sinclair was having a conversation he did not want to be having. His office was all glass and steel and intentional silence, the kind of office that was designed to communicate power before a single word was spoken. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Boston financial district. A single lamp burned on the desk. The rest of the room was dim. Ethan was standing with his back to the door, jacket off, tie loosened, staring out at the storm. The Morrison Klein account is worth $63 million over 5 years, said the man behind him. Derek Holt, Senior VP of Acquisitions, had been Ethan's right hand for 6 years. He knew when to push and when to let things breathe. Tonight, he was pushing. If the Monday presentation falls apart, it won't fall apart. Ethan, it won't. He turned it around. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time. There were shadows under his eyes that had taken up permanent residence sometime around 3 years ago and never left. Where's the presentation? Derek's expression shifted. That's actually what I need to talk to you about. Ethan looked at him. The junior assistant who built the whole thing, Ava Bennett, she left her laptop. We can't reach her by phone and the building's already locked down for the weekend. You have her home address? HR does. Ethan picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Derek blinked. What are you doing? Getting the laptop. Ethan, you're the CEO. You don't personally. I'll be back in an hour. He was already walking toward the door, and there was something in the way he moved. Not rushed, not dramatic, just completely resolved. That made Derek step aside without another word. Ethan paused at the doorway. Tell Mrs. Calloway I'll be late picking up Liam. Tell her... He stopped, adjusted. Tell her I said thank you. She doesn't hear that enough. Then he was gone. The address HR had on file for Ava Bennett was on Meridian Street in East Boston. Ethan's driver, Paul, navigated the company car through streets that got narrower and quieter the further east they went. The kind of streets where corner stores had iron security grates even when they were open, where the apartment buildings had windows that didn't quite seal against the cold, where the sidewalks were cracked in patterns that suggested they hadn't been maintained in a decade. Ethan sat in the back seat and looked out the window without comment. He'd grown up wealthy. He knew that. He wasn't delusional about the distance between his world and the one currently passing outside the window. But there was something particular about seeing that distance at night, in the rain, from the back of a car that cost more than most people in this neighborhood earned in 3 years. That made the discomfort sit differently. Paul pulled up in front of a 4-story building, pale yellow brick, a buzzer panel by the front door with half the name labels missing. Building 14, Paul said. Apartment 3C. Ethan got out of the car. The rain was still coming down. He didn't bother with an umbrella. He found the buzzer for 3C, pressed it, and waited. Nothing. He pressed again. A burst of static from the speaker, then a voice. Young, female, slightly out of breath. Hello, Ms. Bennett? Ethan leaned slightly toward the intercom. This is Ethan Sinclair. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he wondered if the connection had cut out. Then, I'm sorry. Who? Ethan Sinclair from Sinclair Global. He paused. You left your laptop. Another long silence. Then the door buzzed open. Bots. The hallway smelled like someone had been cooking, something with garlic and onion, and the fluorescent light on the second-floor landing was flickering in a way that made the whole corridor look like the opening scene of a horror movie. The carpet runner was clean but visibly old, the kind of pattern that had gone out of style before Ethan was born. He climbed to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door marked 3C. It opened almost immediately. Ava Bennett looked, and Ethan would think about this later, alone, in the kind of quiet that gives you too much time to be honest with yourself. Like someone who had been holding everything together for a very long time and had gotten very good at not showing the seams. She was in jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, dark hair still damp from the rain, eyes wide and confused and slightly horrified in the way a person looks when someone they have never had a real conversation with shows up at their front door. She was shorter than he remembered from the office, or maybe she just seemed that way without the professional armor people put on when they come to work. She was also, clearly, in the middle of something. He could hear it behind her, small, frightened crying, the kind of sound that belongs to a child. Ava glanced back over her shoulder, then back at him. Something shifted in her expression, a flash of something complicated, embarrassed, and protective at the same time. Mr. Sinclair? Her voice was steadier than her eyes. I didn't... You didn't have to come yourself. I know. He held out the laptop bag. The presentation. She took it from him, both hands, like it was something fragile. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Tonight has been... She exhaled, stopped trying to explain. Thank you. From inside the apartment, the crying got louder. Not a tantrum sound. More like a scared sound. Ava turned again, distracted. I'm sorry. 1 second. She left the door open, which wasn't quite an invitation, but wasn't a dismissal either, and disappeared into the apartment. Ethan stood at the threshold. He probably should have left. He had the confirmation the laptop had been delivered. He had a car waiting outside and a son he needed to pick up, and roughly 47 other things demanding his attention. The professional transaction was complete. He stayed anyway. Through the open doorway, he could hear Ava's voice shift. The tension in it dropped away completely, replaced by something softer and steadier than anything in her professional register. Hey, look at me. It's okay. It's just thunder. It can't hurt you. A small, tearful voice. It's so loud. I know. But loud doesn't mean dangerous, okay? Come here. I want Mama. A beat. I know, baby. I know you do. There was something in those 4 words, the weight of them, the way they sat in the air, that went through Ethan like a current. Not dramatic, not sharp, just there. The The kind of thing that finds the part of you that knows exactly what that sentence means. He stepped into the doorway. Ava was on the floor in the small living room, a little girl of maybe 5 years old tucked against her side. The girl had her face buried in Ava's sweatshirt, and Ava had one arm around her and was rubbing slow circles on her back. The apartment was small. He could see the whole of it almost from the doorway. A second-hand couch, a small kitchen with mismatched chairs, a bookshelf with more library books than personal ones. Everything clean, everything careful. Everything that said, someone works hard to make this feel like home. The little girl looked up and saw Ethan. Her eyes went enormous. "Who is that?" she whispered. Ava looked up, saw him in the doorway. Something flickered across her face, embarrassment again, and something else. She shuddered quickly. "That's a man from my work," she said. "He just came to drop something off." She looked at Ethan with an expression that said, clearly and without hostility, "You can go." Ethan nodded once. He should have gone. Instead, for reasons he could not have explained to Derek or to Paul or to anyone else waiting for him on the other side of this evening, he sat down on the floor. Not the couch. The floor. Cross-legged, back against the door frame. Like a person who remembered how to be in a room with a frightened child. Ava stared at him. The little girl stared at him. Outside, thunder rolled again, long and low. "You know," Ethan said, addressing the little girl in a conversational tone, "when I was about your age, I used to think thunderstorms were basically professional." The little girl's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "Like, they had a whole system. The lightning guys, the thunder guys. Very organized, very serious about their work." The girl considered this. "That's silly." "Probably." He shrugged. "But it made them less scary." Ava was watching him, not the child, him, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "What's your name?" he asked the girl. "Sophie, Bess." A pause. "I'm 5 3/4. "Very important distinction," Ethan said. "The 3/4 part." Sophie almost smiled. Didn't quite, but almost. He looked at Ava then, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The rain hit the window in gusts. The fluorescent light in the hallway still flickered. Sophie made a small sound against Ava's shoulder, and gradually, slowly, the rigid tension in her small body began to ease. Ava's expression was doing something complicated. "She's my niece," Ava said quietly, not quite explaining, not quite offering, just filling the silence with something true. "Her mom, my sister, works nights. On Fridays." "I figured," Ethan said, which wasn't entirely accurate. He hadn't figured anything, he'd only just understood, but it seemed like the right thing to say. He left 20 minutes later. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch by then, wrapped in a blanket that had cartoon dogs on it, her breathing slow and steady, the storm outside reduced to background noise. Ava walked Ethan to the door, and they stood there in that particular awkwardness of two people who have just shared something unexpectedly human and are not sure what to do with it. "Thank you," Ava said, "for bringing it yourself. You didn't have to." "No," he agreed. "And for the storm thing. With Sophie, that was—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "That helped." He nodded. There was a moment where something could have been said, something honest and unscripted. He felt it the way you feel a room before a fire catches, the slight shift in temperature, the sense of potential. He let it pass. "The presentation," he said instead. "Monday. It's good work." I looked at it. Something in her face shifted. Surprise, maybe? Or the particular kind of emotion that surfaces when you've worked hard on something and someone acknowledges it without qualifiers. "Thank you," she said, quietly, like she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. "I don't say things I don't mean," Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment. "Okay." He put his hands in his jacket pockets and started toward the stairs. "Mr. Sinclair." He turned. Ava was standing in her doorway, the light from her apartment falling around her, Sophie's cartoon dog blanket just visible behind her, the whole worn and careful architecture of her life framing her like a picture. She looked slightly embarrassed again, and then determined. "I know this is not how junior assistants talk to CEOs," she said, "but you came here in the rain in person to bring me a laptop, and you sat on my floor." A beat. "Whatever that was, thank you." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Get some sleep, Ms. Bennett, he said. Monday's going to be a long day. And he walked down the stairs. Paul was waiting by the car, umbrella open. He didn't say anything when Ethan got in. He'd worked for Ethan long enough to know when silence was appropriate. They pulled away from Meridian Street. The rain kept falling. Ethan looked out the window. I was thinking about Sophie saying, "I want mama." The uncomplicated devastation of it, the way children say the truest things in the simplest words. I was thinking about the way Ava had shifted her voice when she went to that little girl. Not performed comfort, actual comfort, the real thing, coming from somewhere practiced and genuine. I was thinking about his own son, Liam, 6 years old, currently at Mrs. Calloway's house 8 miles away, probably already asleep, probably clutching the worn stuffed rabbit he still wouldn't admit he needed, and about all the nights Ethan had been away at things that mattered less than being in that room. He was thinking about loneliness, not the dramatic kind, the everyday kind, the kind that accumulates quietly and becomes the background of everything. He pulled out his phone, called Mrs. Calloway. She answered on the second ring. "He's asleep," she said, before he could speak. "He asked me to leave the hall light on." "He's fine, Ethan. He had 3 glasses of apple juice and fell asleep during a cartoon." Ethan exhaled. "Thank you, Margaret." "Stop thanking me and just come get him tomorrow morning. He wants pancakes." "I'll make pancakes." "You'll try to make pancakes," she corrected, and he could hear the warmth in it. He hung up. The car moved through the rain-dark city, and Ethan Sinclair, billionaire, widower, father, and the kind of lonely that doesn't have a clean name, leaned his head back against the seat and thought about a woman sitting on a floor with a frightened child, and how long it had been since he'd felt something as simple and real as what had been in that small apartment. He didn't have a name for it. He didn't try to give it one, but it was there. Monday morning came with cold sunshine and the particular anxiety of a high-stakes presentation in a building where everyone pretends they aren't nervous. Ava arrived 40 minutes early. She had the laptop. She had the backup files on 2 separate drives because she had spent Sunday redoing everything twice just to be sure. She had printed copies of the key slides, which nobody had asked for, but which she kept in a folder labeled Morrison Klein Backup in careful block letters. She had concealer under her eyes from the sleep she hadn't gotten, and coffee in a thermos she'd been refilling since 6 a.m. She was ready. She was terrified. The Sinclair Global Conference Room on the 38th floor seated 20 people and had a view of the harbor that was specifically designed to make visitors feel both impressed and slightly off balance. The Morrison Klein team arrived at 8:55. 4 people in expensive suits, the kind of polished blankness that said, "We have heard a lot of presentations, and most of them don't move us." Ava sat at the far end of the conference table, technically present as support staff. Her job was to be there if anything broke. Her job was not to present. That changed at 9:14. The scheduled presenter, a senior analyst named Gregory Walsh, had been the one to originally manage this account before handing it off. He had not, it emerged, properly reviewed the new projections Ava had built from scratch. He began presenting confidently and incorrectly, citing figures that were 14 months out of date, and Ava watched the Morrison Klein lead, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Reeves, begin making small notes in the margin of her printed agenda in a way that looked polite and was actually damning. Marcus Chen, sitting 2 seats from Ethan at the head of the table, caught Ava's eye. She looked at him. He looked at the slide on the screen. She looked at the slide. She felt the particular horror of watching something go wrong in slow motion. Then she looked at Ethan. He was already watching her. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just looked at her with an expression that was not quite a question, more like a door left open. Ava took a breath. She stood up. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Gregory, I think you might be working from the original projection deck. The updated version has some significant differences in the Q3 and Q4 forecasts. Would it be all right if I walked through those?" Gregory stared at her. There was a specific kind of senior employee outrage in his expression, the kind reserved for junior staff who have forgotten their place. But Patricia Reeves was already leaning forward slightly, interested for the first time since she'd walked into the room. "Please," Patricia said. Ava walked to the front of the room. She talked for 22 minutes. She talked about the market analysis, the risk mitigation strategy, The three-scenario forecast she'd built in response to the volatility in the tech sector that Gregory's original projections had completely failed to account for. She talked about Morrison Klein's specific portfolio vulnerabilities and how Sinclair Global's proposal addressed each one by name. She referenced page numbers. She referenced her own modeling. She answered two sharp questions from Patricia Reeves in real time, without checking anything, because she knew this material, the way you know things. You've built yourself from the ground up. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Patricia Reeves clicked her pen twice. "Where has she been?" she asked, directing the question at Ethan with a slight tilt of her head toward Ava. Ethan looked at Ava. Something in his expression had changed from this morning, from the previous Friday night. There was a quality to it that she couldn't categorize and didn't have time to examine. "She's been here," he said. "We've been underutilizing her." Marcus made a sound that might have been a cough. The Morrison Klein team signed the initial agreement framework before noon. Afterward, when the conference room had emptied and Ava was packing up the backup copies she'd made, and the folder she'd labeled in block letters, and the various emergency materials that had not in the end been needed, she heard the door open. She already knew whose footsteps those were. She wasn't sure how. She hadn't been paying attention to the sound of Ethan Sinclair's walk for long enough to have memorized it, but she knew anyway. "That was impressive," he said. She didn't look up immediately, kept stacking papers. "I should have caught Gregory's mistake earlier. I should have—" "Ava." She looked up. He was standing on the other side of the conference table, jacket on, both hands resting on the back of a chair, and the morning light from the harbor windows was coming in at a low angle that made the room look warmer than conference rooms usually do. "You saved that account," he said. "You can stop cataloging the ways it could have gone better." She held his gaze for a moment. "Is that what you do? When you win something?" He thought about that. "No," he admitted. "I usually spend an hour thinking about the three things I could have done better." "See," she said, and something in her face softened slightly. "Then don't give me advice you don't follow yourself." He looked at her. A beat of silence. And then, quiet, unexpected, breaking the careful, controlled surface of everything, he laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was surprised out of him. A short, genuine sound that belonged to a different version of the man who sat at the head of that table. Ava looked at him like she was seeing something she hadn't expected. "Have lunch with me," he said. The words came out before he'd finished deciding to say them. He registered this, distantly, and didn't take them back. Ava blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Lunch. Today. There's a place on Rose Wharf, quiet. No one from the office goes there at noon." He stopped, started again. "I want to hear your ideas on the Henderson portfolio. You've been working on it." This was true. It was also, and they both understood this, not entirely the point. Ava looked at the folder in her hands, at the conference table between them, at the 42 floors of professional hierarchy that separated a junior assistant from the man who signed everyone's paychecks. "Okay," she said. "What?" The restaurant on Rose Wharf was called Harborlight, and it had the kind of atmosphere that was designed for the kind of lunch where no one checks their phone. Small tables, good light, the harbor visible through wide windows, the water gray-green and moving. They ordered without looking at the prices, though for different reasons. For the first 15 minutes, they talked about work. Henderson portfolio, emerging market exposure, the gap in Sinclair Global's mid-tier client strategy. Ava had opinions that were more developed than most people 2 levels above her in the company, and she gave them without the careful hedging that junior staff usually used as self-protection. Ethan asked follow-up questions, real ones, not the kind you ask to appear engaged, the kind you ask because you want to know. And then, at some point, around the middle of the meal, after the waiter had come and gone and the work conversation had exhausted itself naturally, the quality of the silence changed. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ava said. He paused. "You can ask." "Friday night. Why did you sit on my floor?" Ethan set down his fork, looked at the table for a moment. "I don't know," he said, which was honest, if incomplete. "You could have just handed me the laptop and left." "Yes. Most people in your position would have sent someone, or called building security. Probably." "So why—" "Because you were clearly having a hard night," he said. "And because your niece was scared." He paused. "And because—" He stopped again. The sentence didn't have a clean ending. Ava waited. "I have a son," Ethan said finally. Liam, he's 6, and I know what scared sounds like from a child in a thunderstorm. And I know what it looks like when someone is taking care of a child alone and trying to hold everything else together at the same time. Ava looked at him. His mother, she said carefully, not asking but giving him room. She died. Flat. Practiced. The way you say a thing you've said 100 times and have learned to say without breaking. 3 years ago, Liam was 3. I'm sorry. I'm fine. Automatic. Then, I'm not. I don't mean that the way it sounds. I mean, I'm functioning. We're functioning. He's good. He's such a. Something moved through his face, warm and private. He's a remarkable kid. But you're not fine, Ava said. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't pushing. It was just accurate. Ethan looked at her. No, he said after a moment. Not always. Ava nodded slowly. My sister, Sophie's mom. She's been through a lot too. Different things. And I watch her hold it together for Sophie, and I think. She shook her head. Functioning is its own kind of brave. It just doesn't get a lot of credit. Ethan didn't say anything. He just looked at her in the way that people sometimes do when someone has articulated something they've been trying to understand for years. Outside the harbor window, a boat moved through the gray water. A seagull sat on a pylon in the rain-washed light. Tell me about Liam, Ava said. And he did. He talked about Liam for 45 minutes, about how Liam had recently decided that he wanted to be both an astronaut and a professional soccer player, and saw absolutely no conflict between these goals. About how he hoarded apple juice boxes in his bedroom and denied it with complete conviction even when you could see them. About how he still slept with a stuffed rabbit named Captain, because the rabbit had apparently earned a rank. And about how he'd once told Ethan, with perfect seriousness, that he thought grown-ups were too worried about germs. About how he laughed. Big, full-body laughs that started in his stomach and had no self-consciousness in them at all. About how some mornings, when he climbed into Ethan's bed at 6 a.m. and immediately began talking, Ethan thought, this is why I'm still here. This is the only thing that makes sense. Ava listened to all of it. She didn't perform attentiveness. She was just listening. Her eyes on him, her expression open, the kind of listening that makes a person feel like what they're saying matters. When he finally ran out of things to say, they sat quietly for a moment. He sounds like someone worth being tired for, Ava said. Ethan looked at her. Yeah, he said softly. He really is. They walked back toward the Sinclair Global building along the waterfront path, the wind off the harbor, cold and honest. Ava had her coat pulled around her and her hands in her pockets. I should tell you something, she said. Okay. When Marcus told me you'd brought the laptop yourself Friday night before you actually showed up, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Or a test. I thought maybe someone was pranking me. A test, Ethan repeated. People at your level don't come to Meridian Street, she said. Not accusatory, just clear. That's not how the world works. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I know. She exhaled, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. I want you to know that I don't have any illusions about this, about what Friday was, or what today is. I'm a junior assistant. She gestured vaguely toward the Sinclair Global Tower, visible 3 blocks ahead. Ethan, he said. She blinked. What? My name, not your, with a gesture at a building. The corner of his mouth moved. Ethan. Ava stared at him for a moment. Then, Ethan, trying it out, slightly awkward. I still want you to know that I'm not. I know what you're not, he said. I'm aware of who you are and what your position is at the company and what the appropriate professional distance is. I've been aware of all of it all morning. He paused. I still asked you to lunch. She looked at him. I'm not entirely sure why, he added, which was the most honest thing he'd said all day, and they both knew it. Ava thought about this for a moment, walking. The harbor to their left, the city around them, the professional world waiting 3 blocks ahead. My grandmother used to say, she said slowly, that the worst thing you can do to yourself is pretend a door is a wall because opening it seems complicated. Ethan was quiet. I don't know what that means for any of this, Ava added quickly. I'm not suggesting anything. She shook her head at herself. Ignore that. I won't, he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set, a small line between his brows that could have been thought or something harder to name. They reached the building. The doorman held the lobby door. The professional world closed around them again like water, and by the time they'd reached the elevator bank, they were back to the appropriate distance and the appropriate register and the appropriate pretense that the last 2 hours had been purely about business. But something had shifted. Both of them felt it, and neither of them said so. That was the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Ava was promoted to senior analyst on a temporary trial basis, a decision Marcus Chen announced in the Monday meeting with the careful neutrality of a man who understood the optics and had already covered the paperwork. Gregory Walsh submitted a complaint to HR and withdrew it 2 days later, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about Gregory's confidence in his position. Ava threw herself into the work with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. She was the first one in and frequently the last to leave. She made mistakes, caught them herself, corrected them, documented them, and came back the next day with better systems. She did not talk about Ethan in the office. She was careful in the way that people are careful when they understand exactly what is at stake. But on 3 separate evenings across those weeks, she and Ethan had dinner, not at visible places. Quiet restaurants, a place in Cambridge he'd been going to for years, once just takeout eaten in a conference room on the 41st floor after everyone else had gone home, sitting on opposite ends of a table with the city lights coming in through the windows and talking for 2 hours about nothing in particular. He told her about his company, not the version in the press releases, but the real one, the version with the cracks and the anxieties and the decisions he second-guessed in the middle of the night. She told him about growing up, the specific texture of being the responsible one in a family that couldn't always hold itself together, the way she'd learned to be useful as a form of belonging. They did not talk about what they were doing or what any of it meant. The not talking about it was its own language. One Thursday night, he called her at 10:30. Not for a work reason. There was no work reason. And they talked for an hour about whether the hedgehog Liam was begging for was a practical idea. Ethan, no. Ava, also no, but with more affectionate reasons. And about the book she was reading, and about a restaurant in Lisbon he'd been to on a business trip that had served the best seafood he'd ever eaten, and he'd spent 10 minutes trying to explain exactly what made it different. When they hung up, Ava sat on her couch in her small apartment on Meridian Street. The furniture slightly shifted from where it had been because she'd been reorganizing the bookshelves last weekend, and thought, this is the part where I should be careful. She knew exactly what careful looked like. She had practiced it her entire life. And then she thought about Ethan on her floor with Sophie, in his expensive jacket, talking about Thunder being professional. She thought about him in Harbor Light, talking about Liam, with that private warmth moving across his face. She thought about him walking beside her on the waterfront, saying, I still asked you to lunch, in a voice that was simply honest. She picked up her phone, looked at his contact name, she'd added him under ES like a person in a spy movie, and put the phone face down on the couch. Be careful, she told herself. She was already failing at it. And somewhere across the city, in a waterfront house that had too many rooms and not enough warmth, Ethan Sinclair stood at the window with a glass of water, watching the harbor lights, thinking about a woman on Meridian Street who had told him that functioning was its own kind of brave. He thought she was right. He also thought she had no idea what she'd started. The hedgehog never happened. Ethan had held firm on that one, which Liam accepted with the particular brand of dramatic suffering that 6-year-olds deploy when they've lost a negotiation but refuse to fully concede. He spent an entire Saturday morning speaking to Ethan only in wounded sighs, which Ethan weathered with the calm of a man who had learned to pick his battles, and this was not one he was losing. By afternoon, Liam had apparently forgiven him, because he climbed into Ethan's lap during a documentary about deep-sea fish and fell asleep within 12 minutes. Ethan sat there for a long time afterward, not moving, one hand resting on the back of his son's head, watching footage of bioluminescent creatures moving through water so deep it had no color, thinking about nothing in particular. Or telling himself he was thinking about nothing in particular. I was actually thinking about the previous evening, the phone call that had lasted an hour, the way Ava had laughed at his Lisbon story. Not politely, not the way people laugh at their boss's stories, but genuinely, slightly incredulous, saying, you spent 10 minutes describing bread? And then listening to the 10 minutes about the bread anyway. He'd been on the phone with people his whole adult life. Conference calls, investor pitches, negotiations, condolence calls, The late-night calls you get from hospitals that change everything. He knew the full spectrum of what phone calls could be. He hadn't had a phone call that felt like that one in a long time. He didn't examine it too closely. He was good at not examining things too closely. It was, depending on how generous you were being with yourself, either wisdom or avoidance. And the line between the two had always been blurry in his experience. Liam stirred slightly, made a small sound, settled again. Ethan looked at his son's sleeping face. The particular perfection of it, that unself-conscious peace that children have when they sleep, the way all the day's drama just goes somewhere else for a while. He thought about what Ava had said. Functioning is its own kind of brave. He'd been turning that sentence over for days without meaning to, like a stone you pick up from a beach and keep finding in your jacket pocket. He put his phone on the side table face down. He was getting better at that. The next Monday, Ava walked into the office with a revised analysis of the Henderson portfolio that Marcus Chen read twice before forwarding it to 3 department heads with a note that said simply, "See attached." Comments? In Marcus's specific communication style, this was approximately equal to a standing ovation. She was at her desk when Ethan passed through her floor, which he did not normally do. His day was structured around the 39th through 42nd floors. And she was on the phone, pen in hand, annotating a printout with the focused aggression of someone who has found an error and is professionally delighted about it. She didn't see him. He didn't stop. He kept walking, nodded to the 2 analysts who noticed him, and continued toward the elevator. But he was thinking, she doesn't perform when she thinks nobody's watching, which was rarer than it should have been in his world. That evening he texted her, not called, texted, which felt marginally less like he was doing something deliberate. Henderson revision. Good catch on the currency exposure gap. Walsh missed that for 8 months. Her reply came 4 minutes later. Walsh misses a lot of things. I have a list. Then almost immediately after. That was unprofessional. Forget I said that. He typed back. I have the same list. Yours is probably more accurate. 3 seconds. Then, are you allowed to say that? I own the company. A longer pause. Then a single laughing emoji, which she clearly sent and then possibly immediately regretted, because it was followed by, Good night, Mr. Sinclair. Ethan, he typed. Good night, Ethan. He put the phone down. He was sitting at the desk in his home office, the harbor visible through the window behind him, the house quiet in the way that big houses get quiet after a child goes to sleep. Not peaceful exactly, more like held breath. He looked at his phone for a moment, at her name on the screen. He was doing something, he understood. He wasn't sure what to call it. He wasn't sure he was ready to call it anything. But he was doing it. The weeks moved the way weeks do when something is changing slowly, and you keep trying not to notice, which only makes you more aware of every small thing. Ava's promotion from temporary to permanent senior analyst came through at the end of October, accompanied by a salary adjustment that made her sit very still at her computer for about 30 seconds before she pulled up her bank account, looked at the numbers, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not relief exactly, something more than relief. The specific sensation of solid ground under your feet after a long time of testing every step. She called her sister that night. I got the promotion, she said, when Dana picked up. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, for real? For real. Ava. Her sister's voice cracked at the edges. Ava, come on. Don't cry, I'll cry. I'm not crying. Dana was absolutely crying. I told you from the beginning you were too good for that assistant job. It took 4 years. Good things take time, Sophie! Dana was apparently now talking to both of them simultaneously. Say congratulations to Aunt Ava. A pause. Then Sophie's small, serious voice in the background. Congratulations. Articulating each syllable like it was its own sentence. Ava laughed, pressed her free hand over her eyes. Tell her thank you. She wants to know if you're going to buy a bigger apartment now. Tell her maybe someday. She says, why not now? Tell her adults are complicated. She says, I know. Ava was still laughing when she hung up. She sat in her apartment on Meridian Street, in the quiet after the call, and looked around at the mismatched furniture and the library books and the bookshelf she'd reorganized twice in the past month. And she thought, this isn't failure. This was never failure. This was just the beginning, taking a long time. She went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks. She slept well. It was a Thursday in early November, when things shifted into something neither of them could keep calling nothing. It started with Liam. Ethan had a late afternoon meeting that ran 40 minutes over, and his regular arrangement for picking up Liam from after-school care fell through when Mrs. Calloway's daughter went into early labor, and Margaret left in a justifiable hurry with 30 minutes' notice. His backup, a college student named Josh, who occasionally filled in, had an exam. His second backup didn't answer the phone. I was standing in the middle of a meeting, had excused himself to handle it, and was running through his contacts list with the specific controlled urgency of a man who is very close to the edge of a logistical crisis and cannot afford to show it on his face. He called Ava. I wasn't sure why. She was not on his contacts list as a childcare solution. She was on his contacts list as someone he had been texting at 9 p.m. about work things that were increasingly not entirely about work. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, I have a situation," he said. "Okay." "Liam's after-school care closes at 6. I have a meeting I cannot leave for another 40 minutes at minimum. My usual—" He stopped, started over. "I don't have anyone to pick him up." A beat. "Send me the address." "Ava, you don't have to—" "Ethan, send me the address." He sent it. She picked up Liam at 5:53, which gave her 7 minutes to introduce herself to the after-school coordinator, explain that she was a family friend, and show the authorization form Ethan had texted over after a frantic call to the school's administrative line. The coordinator looked at the form, looked at Ava, looked at Liam, who had been sitting at a small table with a drawing he'd been working on for the past hour, and said, "Liam, this lady says she knows your dad." Liam looked up. He studied Ava with the frank, unselfconscious assessment that children use before they've learned it's rude to stare. She looked back at him. He had Ethan's eyes, that same quality of seeing more than they were saying, in a face that was still entirely childhood, round-cheeked and open. "Are you the one from the phone?" he asked. Ava blinked. "What?" "Dad talks on the phone a lot. He laughs sometimes now." He said this as if reporting a weather change, factual, slightly puzzled, not unkind. "Mrs. Calloway says it's good." Ava had no idea what to do with that sentence. She filed it somewhere and smiled. "I'm Ava. I work with your dad." "He talks about your work a lot," Liam said, and gathered his backpack with the efficiency of a child ready to leave. "Can we get hot chocolate? Mrs. Calloway always gets hot chocolate." "I think that can be arranged." They went to a place 2 blocks from the school, a bakery with small tables and a heating vent that made the whole front of the shop warm in a reliable, unpretentious way. Liam ordered hot chocolate with "a lot of marshmallows, please," and then immediately corrected himself. "Extra marshmallows, as many as they have." The woman at the counter put in 8. Liam accepted this as a fair opening position. Ava ordered coffee. They sat across from each other at a small table. "What were you drawing?" she asked. Liam pulled a folded piece of paper from his backpack. He'd apparently taken it with him, and spread it on the table. It was a drawing in crayon of what appeared to be a spaceship, but with a soccer goal floating next to it in the atmosphere of what might have been Mars. "It's my plan," he explained with complete seriousness. "For what?" "Being an astronaut and a soccer player. They said I couldn't do both. I'm proving I can." "Who said you couldn't?" "Tyler, in my class." A pause. "He's wrong about most things." Ava looked at the drawing, at the careful way he'd colored the spaceship blue and added small stars around it in yellow, at the tiny figure in a spacesuit standing in front of the soccer goal. "I think you might be right about Tyler." Liam looked at her with sudden warm approval. "Dad said that too." "Your dad's a pretty smart guy." "Sometimes." Liam picked up his hot chocolate with both hands, which was the right approach given the size of the mug. "He forgets to buy orange juice sometimes. We always run out." "That seems like a fixable problem." "I tell him every week." He shook his head with the weary patience of someone who has been managing an adult for years. "Every week." Ava pressed her lips together to keep the smile from getting too wide. "I'll mention it to him." "Thank you. Very solemn, very sincere." They stayed in the bakery for an hour. Liam told her about his class, about his teacher Mrs. Okafor, who was the best teacher he'd ever had, about the book series he was currently obsessed with, that involved a kid who could talk to animals, and a series of increasingly improbable adventures. He asked Ava questions with the non-hierarchical curiosity of children. What was her favorite color? Did she have a dog? What did she do at work? Did she know how to draw? Was Boston her favorite city, or just the city she was in? She answered all of them honestly, including the last one, which turned into a slightly longer conversation about whether a city could be your favorite if it was the only one you'd really lived in, and Liam's conclusion that you should probably visit more cities before deciding, which was reasonable advice from any angle. When Ethan arrived, slightly disheveled, jacket open, tie loosened, carrying the look of a man who'd been walking fast for several blocks, he stopped in the doorway of the bakery and took in the scene. His son, hot chocolate mostly consumed, marshmallows gone, leaning across the table showing Ava something on the drawing. Ava, leaning in, nodding, asking questions. He stood there for a moment before either of them noticed him. Something happened in his chest. Not dramatic. Not a sudden revelation, just a quiet shift. The particular sensation of seeing something you hadn't known you'd been missing and recognizing it without any preparation. Liam looked up. Dad, Ava says Tyler is wrong about most things. Ethan looked at Ava. She looked back at him, and there was a small, complicated expression on her face, warm and slightly careful. The expression of someone who has been unexpectedly given something they didn't ask for and isn't sure yet if they're allowed to keep it. Tyler usually is, Ethan said. He came to the table, put a hand briefly on Liam's shoulder, the automatic gesture of a parent checking in, making sure the world had been okay, and sat down. Thank you, he said to Ava. It was fine. She looked at Liam. It was actually good. She bought me extra marshmallows, Liam informed Ethan. How many? 8. That's a lot of marshmallows. It was a lot of hot chocolate. Liam seemed satisfied with this ratio. They stayed another 30 minutes. The three of them, at the small table in the warm bakery, in a formation that wasn't designed or planned or talked about, that had assembled itself out of a childcare emergency and a phone call and whatever had been building between two people for the past 6 weeks. Liam talked. Ethan and Ava occasionally spoke to each other across him, and occasionally to him, and the whole thing was slightly awkward in the way new things are awkward. Not unpleasantly, just honestly. Walking to the car afterward, Liam between them, he reached up and took Ava's hand, just like that. No announcement, no request. The way children do things, directly, without all the scaffolding adults build around their impulses. Ava looked down at him, surprised. Liam wasn't looking at her. He was looking ahead, swinging their joined hands slightly, apparently fine. Ethan saw it. He didn't say anything. He just looked at his son's profile, then at Ava's face, and the expression he wore was something she'd never seen on him before, something cracked open and unguarded. Not quite smiling, more than that. She held Liam's hand the rest of the way to the car. After that, the careful distances got harder to maintain. It wasn't any single moment. It was accumulation. The way feelings actually work, not in lightning bolts, but in gradual saturation, like water coming up through the ground, until one day you notice you're standing in it. They had dinner twice in the next 2 weeks. Proper dinners, not work-adjacent things, and they both knew they weren't work-adjacent things, even though neither of them named it. At the second one, a quiet Italian place in the South End with candles that dripped wax onto the checkered tablecloth, Ethan told her about Claire. He hadn't planned to. They'd been talking about his company, about the early years, the decisions he'd made at 28 when he'd first started building it, the ones that looked smart in retrospect and the ones that still kept him up sometimes. And then somehow they were talking about the years before the company mattered as much. The years when it was just him and Claire in a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlestown, both of them working too hard, both of them believing they had more time than they did. She was funny, he said, and there was something surprised in his own voice, like he'd forgotten that and was only now remembering. People always talk about her like she was kind, compassionate, warm, all true. But she was also genuinely, wickedly funny. She used to do these impressions of my board members that were so accurate it was almost professionally dangerous. Ava smiled. What happened? He looked at his wine glass. An accident. 3 years ago, February. She was coming home from a work trip. Delayed flight. Bad weather. She was in a cab from the airport. He paused. Liam was 3. He doesn't really remember her. He has pictures and stories, but not memory. And He stopped. Set the glass down. I kept waiting for there to be a point where the grief would run out, where it would just be finished. But it doesn't work like that. No, Ava said quietly. It doesn't. I buried myself as a company for about a year and told myself it was for Liam, that I was securing his future, which was partly true and partly... He looked up at her. Partly just easier than being in the house. She nodded, not in judgment, in recognition. You know what that is, he said. I've done my own versions of it, she admitted. Different circumstances. When my dad left, I was 16. I started doing everyone else's problems because it was easier than the one in my own house. She picked at the edge of her napkin. I got very good at being useful. It's a good way to not have to think about yourself. Does it work? For a while. She looked at him directly. And then eventually you run out of other people's problems, and you have to deal with your own. Except now you're 30, and you never actually learned how. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. How do you know how to say exactly the things that are true? She shook her head, slightly embarrassed. I don't. I'm just guessing. You're not guessing. She didn't answer that. Outside the restaurant, through the window, a couple walked past under an umbrella, their shoulders touching, talking about something that made one of them laugh. Ava watched them for a second and then looked back at the table. Can I tell you something? She said. Yeah, I've been careful about this, about what we're doing or not doing, or whatever we're calling it. She took a breath. Because I know how it looks from the outside. I'm an employee who got a promotion. You're the CEO. People will have opinions. People will have opinions about everything, Ethan said. That's not a reason. I know it's not a reason. I'm not saying it stops me. I'm saying... She looked for the right words and couldn't find them without being more honest than she'd planned to be tonight. I'm saying I don't know how to do this halfway. I never have. And I'm aware that's a liability when the other person has more reasons than most to... She paused. To be somewhere halfway feels safer. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. I've been careful, too, in ways that aren't entirely fair to either of us. He turned the wine glass slowly on the tablecloth. When Claire died, I made a decision, not consciously, more like a conclusion I reached without really choosing it, that I was done with the part of life that included this, whatever this is, that Liam and the company were enough, and that wanting more than that was, he paused, greedy. That's not what greedy means, Ava said. He almost laughed. No, I know. Wanting to not be alone isn't greedy. I know. He looked at her. I think I just needed someone to say it. A beat. You have a way of doing that. Saying the thing that's sitting in the room like everyone agreed to pretend it wasn't there. Ava stared at the tablecloth. My sister calls it being annoying. It's not annoying. It is sometimes. Probably, he admitted. But not tonight. They looked at each other across the candlelight, across the checkered tablecloth with its wax drips and water rings, and the thing that had been building for weeks was very close to the surface now. She could feel it. She suspected he could too. Neither of them reached for it. Not yet. Walking out of the restaurant, standing on the sidewalk while Paul brought the car around, there was a moment. The kind of moment that is made almost entirely of nearness. The specific distance that is close enough to feel warmth, but far enough to still be choosing. Ava had her coat collar up. Ethan was standing slightly turned toward her, and neither of them was talking about anything, just the quiet of the street after the restaurant's warmth. I should go home, she said. I know. Neither of them moved for a second. Then Paul pulled up. I'll see you Monday, Ava said, and moved toward the curb. Ava. She turned. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at her with an expression that was several things at once, careful and certain at the same time, which shouldn't have worked but did. This is something, he said. Quietly, plainly, with the exhausted honesty of a man who has spent long enough pretending it wasn't. I don't know what to do with it yet, but I want you to know that I know it's something. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. Me too. Paul opened the door. She got in. She looked straight ahead as the car pulled away and did not look back through the window, because she knew if she did, she'd see him still standing there watching the car leave, and she wasn't sure what that would do to the wall. She was still, for now, keeping between her heart and the full weight of this. The wall was getting thinner every day. The following Saturday, Ethan asked her if she wanted to come to Liam's soccer game. Not a work event. Not a dinner with plausible professional justification. A 6-year-old soccer game on a cold November morning, which was about as far from the world of Sinclair Global as anything could be. She showed up in a heavy coat and a knit hat that had a slight bobble at the top, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner, because she'd arrived early enough to need something to do with her hands. Liam spotted her from across the field before the game started, and his face did something magnificent, pure, uncomplicated delight, no performance in it at all. And he came sprinting over in his cleats. "You came," he announced, like this was an event he'd been anticipating but hadn't quite believed would happen. "I said I would," Ava told him. "Dad said you might be busy." "I was busy. I came anyway." Liam processed this with visible satisfaction and ran back to his team. Ethan arrived at her side, having watched all of this from a few feet away. He was in a jacket that was not warm enough for the weather, which was a recurring problem she'd noticed. He dressed for buildings, not for Boston, in November. "You brought coffee," he said. "One of them is yours." She handed it over. "How did you know how I take it?" "You've had approximately 40 cups of coffee in my presence over the past 6 weeks." She looked at the field. Dark roast, splash of milk, no sugar. He looked at her sideways. "I pay attention," she said, and there was something in her voice that was both simple and layered. "It's a thing I do." He watched his son take his position on the field, small and serious and wearing cleats 2 sizes too big because he'd insisted on getting the ones he could grow into, and took a sip of the coffee. "Ava," he said. "I'm watching the game," she said. He smiled. He looked at the field. He watched his son and did not say the thing he'd been building toward for 6 weeks, because they were at a soccer field and she was apparently watching the game, and some things didn't need to be rushed when they were already, clearly, inevitable. Liam's team lost 4-2. Liam scored one of the 2, which he celebrated with the full-body enthusiasm of someone who has no concept of proportional response to good news. He pointed at Ava from the field. She pointed back. Ethan watched this and felt the kind of happiness that is almost painful because you know exactly what it is, and you know exactly how much it costs, and you decide it's worth it anyway. They went for pancakes after. A diner 3 blocks from the field, booths with cracked vinyl, a jukebox that still worked and played things from the 80s. Liam ordered a stack with extra butter and syrup on the side so I can control the distribution, which was a sentence he had clearly gotten from an adult and was using with complete confidence. Ava ordered eggs. Ethan ordered toast and was immediately told by both Liam and Ava, independently, that this was a disappointing choice. "It's a diner," Ava said. "You have to get something unreasonable." "Toast is perfectly unreasonable," she repeated. "Those are the rules." Ethan looked at Liam, who nodded solemnly in confirmation that yes, those were the rules. He ordered pancakes. Liam was visibly satisfied. They sat in the booth, the 3 of them, and the November morning outside was gray and cold, and the diner was warm and loud and slightly chaotic. And Ethan looked at the 2 of them arguing about the optimal syrup distribution strategy with the focused investment of 2 people who have just met and already understand each other, and he thought, this is what I've been missing. Not just someone. This specific, ridiculous, irreplaceable thing. He didn't say it out loud. He wasn't ready yet. The grief was still there, not gone, but quieter. And the fear was still there too. The specific fear that comes from having lost something real and understanding exactly what loss feels like from the inside. But he was here. Present. Actually present, not just physically accounted for. It had been a long time since that was true. Liam fell asleep in the car on the way home, genuinely and completely, the way children fall asleep after cold outdoor mornings. Ethan pulled into the driveway of the waterfront house, and Ava had come because she'd been given a ride from the soccer field and lived in the opposite direction, and she sat in the passenger seat while Ethan turned off the engine. The house was visible through the windshield, large, beautiful, the harbor behind it catching the winter light. It was a house that had been bought for a different life than the one currently being lived inside it. "He loves you," Ethan said quietly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the house. Ava was quiet for a moment. "He barely knows me." Kids don't need that much time. They just know. He turned his head to look at her. "He asked me last week if you were going to come to Thanksgiving." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know." A pause. "I was being a coward." "Ethan, I want you there," he said. And then, without stopping, without letting himself get careful about it, "I want you around. Not as a work thing, and not as an undefined thing, and not as something I'm pretending isn't happening. I want—" He stopped, looked at her fully. "I'm not good at this. I used to be, I think. Before. I'm out of practice, and I know I'm going to do it wrong some of the time. But I want to try. Ava looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that does its own thinking. I'm not easy, she said finally. I have opinions about everything, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong. And I grew up in circumstances that made me not great at assuming things will be fine. I'll expect things to fall apart before they actually fall apart. I'll be waiting for the other shoe. I know, he said. I just want you to... Ava. He said her name like a period at the end of her sentence. I know. She exhaled, looked at her hands. This is terrifying. Yes, you're my boss. We're addressing that. He'd already talked to Marcus and to the company's legal team about restructuring her position into a separate division with an independent reporting line, though he hadn't told her that yet. It won't be an issue. She looked up at him. How are you so calm about this? I'm not calm, he said. I'm just tired of pretending to be indifferent. She laughed, a short, surprised laugh, and then pressed her fingers over her mouth, and there were tears at the edges of her eyes that she was absolutely not going to shed in a car in his driveway in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. Okay, she said, when she'd gotten herself back. Okay? Okay. She met his eyes. Let's try. He nodded, didn't reach for her hand, didn't close whatever space remained between them, just nodded, with the steadiness of a man making a decision he intends to keep. In the back seat, Liam slept on, one cheek pressed against the window, his soccer cleats still on, his small chest rising and falling with the uncomplicated rhythm of a child who had had a good morning. Neither of them knew, sitting there in the quiet car, what was coming. The thing that would arrive without warning and tear through everything they were carefully building, dragging the past into the present with the specific cruelty of unfinished grief. Neither of them knew. For now there was just this, a cold November afternoon, a sleeping child in the back seat, and two people who had decided against every reasonable instinct to try. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Thanksgiving came and Ava was there. She brought sweet potato pie from a bakery in Roxbury that she'd been going to since she was 12 years old, and sweet potato pie from that specific bakery was, in her considered opinion, one of the few things in the world that was genuinely non-negotiable. She also brought a bottle of wine she'd spent 40 minutes selecting because she didn't know what wine went with anything and had eventually just asked the man at the shop to pick something that wouldn't embarrass her, which he did. Mrs. Calloway was there too, which helped, because Margaret Calloway had been feeding people in crisis situations for 63 years and treated the presence of a new woman in Ethan's kitchen with the warm, strategic focus of someone who had been waiting for exactly this development and was not going to waste it. You cook? Margaret asked, the moment Ava set foot in the kitchen. Passably, Ava said. She's being modest, Ethan said from across the kitchen, where he was doing something to the turkey that looked uncertain. I'm genuinely not, Ava said. I cook about 6 things well. Everything else is an experiment. 6 things is 6 more than him, Margaret said, jerking her head toward Ethan with the affectionate dismissiveness of a woman who had watched him attempt to feed himself and his son for 3 years and had opinions about the results. Ethan pointed a basting brush in Margaret's general direction. I make excellent pancakes. You make acceptable pancakes, Liam said from the kitchen table, without looking up from the book he was reading. There's a difference. Margaret laughed. Ava pressed her lips together and said nothing, which was the diplomatically correct response. Ethan looked at his son with an expression of exaggerated betrayal that Liam met with total serenity. It was the kind of afternoon that doesn't announce itself as significant. Just warm and slightly chaotic. Too many people in a kitchen that was designed for quiet efficiency. The smell of food and the sound of a child asking questions about things that had nothing to do with anything. The particular texture of people learning each other's rhythms in real time. Later, when Liam was in bed and Margaret had gone home and the dishes were done, Ava had washed, Ethan had dried, which felt like the most domestic thing she'd done in years. They sat on the back porch with what was left of the wine, looking at the harbor. The November night was cold and clean, the water black and gold with reflected lights, the city a low hum beyond the water. He set a place for you, Ethan said. Ava looked at him. What? This morning, before you got here. He went into the dining room and set a place at the table with the good plates. Ethan looked at the water. I didn't ask him to. He just did it. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan. I know. Oh, that's... She stopped, picked up her wine glass, set it back down. That's a lot. I know. He turned to look at her. He'd been doing this more, looking at her directly, without the careful management he used on most of the world. It doesn't scare me anymore. That it's a lot. It should scare you a little, she said. Being scared keeps you honest. He considered that. Maybe. But I've spent 3 years being scared of everything, and I'm tired of it. He looked back at the water. I want to be here for this. Whatever this is. I want to stop looking at it from a safe distance and actually be in it. She nodded slowly. She understood that. She also felt the particular vulnerability of two people admitting, out loud, that they were in something real. The way saying it changes it, makes it heavier and more present, takes away the deniability. Okay, she said, the same word she'd said in the car 3 weeks ago. Their word, apparently. Their shorthand for I'm here, I'm choosing this, let's go. He found her hand in the dark and held it. Simple as that. They sat there for another hour, not talking much, and it was the kind of quiet that is its own form of intimacy, the kind you only have with someone when you've stopped performing for them. She drove home at midnight. The city was quiet and cold, and she drove through it thinking about set place settings and 6-year-old boys who made decisions with their whole heart, and she thought, she let herself actually think it, for the first time without the usual barricades, I could love this. I might already. It was the most frightening thing she'd felt in years. It was also the most alive. December settled over Boston the way it always does. All at once, and without apology, cold that meant business. The harbor going gray and choppy, the city decorating itself with a slightly desperate cheerfulness. Liam wanted a Christmas tree bigger than Dad, which was negotiated down to slightly taller than Ethan, which remained an impressive tree. Ava came over one Sunday afternoon and they decorated it with ornaments that had accumulated over years. Some clearly Claire's, beautiful and delicate, and some clearly Liam's, handmade and crooked and cherished. Nobody mentioned the ones that were Claire's. Nobody had to. Ava handled them carefully and placed them well and didn't make anything of it, which was exactly the right thing to do, and Ethan noticed it without saying so. Work was changing too. Marcus had finalized the restructuring of Ava's position, and she was now heading a small analysis team within a division that reported independently to the board rather than through the senior VP chain. It was a real position with real authority, built on the actual quality of her work rather than anything else. And she approached it with the focused intensity of someone who had been given an opening and intended to walk through it fully. She was good at the job in ways that still surprised people who'd only known her as the junior assistant who barely had a desk to herself. She had a way of seeing patterns in financial data that wasn't just technical. It was almost intuitive, the product of years of managing household finances under real pressure, of understanding what money meant when there wasn't enough of it, of seeing risk not as an abstract category, but as the difference between stability and disaster. It gave her a perspective that most of the Sinclair Global analysts who had grown up in comfort and gone from private schools to top universities without any material interruption genuinely didn't have. Patricia Reeves from Morrison Klein called Ethan personally in mid-December to compliment your Ava Bennett and ask if she'd be available for a direct consulting relationship, which Ethan answered with the particular tone of a man who was proud and also trying very hard not to be visibly proud in a professional context. He told Ava about the call that evening. She called me your Ava Bennett, he said. Ava looked up from her laptop. They were in his home office, which had become a place she worked sometimes on evenings when they both needed to be working and had agreed that this was more efficient than being in separate buildings, which was true, and also not entirely the point. That's, don't call me your anything at work. I didn't call you anything. Patricia did. Still. But she was trying not to smile. What did you say? I said you were very good at your job and you weren't available for an outside consulting relationship. She looked at him. Ethan, that could be a significant, you're not available, he said simply. You're building something here. Patricia Reeves has plenty of consultants. She doesn't need mine. The word mine sat in the air for a second. Not the professional context it had been in, but something else. And they both registered it, and Ethan very deliberately did not take it back. Yours, Ava repeated. Figure of speech, he said, with a straightness of face that was absolutely not sincere. She went back to her laptop. You are so full of it, she said, but she was smiling at her screen, and he was looking at the side of her face from across the room with the particular expression of a man who has found, against all his expectations, that there is more warmth left in him than he thought. That was December 14th. The call came on December 17th. Ethan was in a meeting when his assistant knocked and entered with the expression people use when something can't wait, but they're not sure how to interrupt. He stepped out. His assistant handed him a slip of paper with a name on it. Nora Whitfield. Says she's Claire's sister. Says it's urgent. He hadn't spoken to Nora Whitfield in 14 months. Claire had been close with her older sister before the accident. They'd talked on the phone twice a week, had a shorthand that came from a shared childhood. After Claire died, Nora had been at the funeral, at the house in the difficult weeks that followed. And then, the grief of families is complicated. The way loss sometimes pulls people together and sometimes pushes them apart. They drifted. Not with anger, just with the slow tide of separate grief pulling in separate directions. He called her back from his office with the door closed. Nora. His voice was careful. It's been a while. I know. She sounded like she hadn't slept. Ethan, I need to talk to you, in person. I've been trying to decide if I should It's been months, and I can't not anymore. I can't keep sitting on this. He felt the particular cold that moves through you when you understand that what is coming is something you cannot prepare for. What is it? Not on the phone. A pause. Please, I'm in Boston. I can come to you. He met her that evening at the house. She arrived at 7, looking like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had run out of the strength to hold the posture that hid it. She was 2 years older than Claire had been, 42 now, with Claire's same dark eyes and none of her sister's specific stillness. She sat on the edge of the couch in Ethan's living room, holding a cup of tea with both hands, and she started talking. She talked for a long time. What Nora said, in the end, came down to this. Before Liam, before the years of building the life that had looked, from the outside, like a happy one, Claire had been pregnant, once before. A pregnancy that had gone wrong at 20 weeks. A loss so early in their marriage that they had told almost no one, that had been folded into the category of private grief and moved past. Ethan knew this. He had been there. What he did not know was what Nora had found in Claire's personal files after the accident, documents, medical records, and a series of letters, handwritten, never sent, that described a decision Claire had made in the months before she died, a decision about the circumstances of that earlier loss. Something that had been told to her differently at the time by a doctor who had subsequently retired and moved out of state, and that Claire had spent the last year of her life trying to quietly and privately investigate, without telling Ethan, because she had not yet found an answer she was certain of, and did not want to bring him a question. She couldn't also bring him an answer to. Nora believed that what Claire had been uncovering was the possibility that the loss had not been inevitable, that there had been a failure somewhere, a misread result, a delayed intervention, that Claire had begun to trace and had not finished tracing before the cab accident took her. Ethan sat very still through all of this. The living room was quiet. Somewhere upstairs, Liam was asleep. The harbor was dark outside the window. Nora sat across from him with her hands wrapped around her cooling tea and her eyes very careful, watching his face. He said eventually, "Why now?" "Because I found the last letter 2 months ago, in a box I hadn't opened since I moved. She'd written it a week before she died." Nora's voice was steady through obvious effort. "She was going to tell you. She had an appointment scheduled with a medical attorney. She had a name. She was almost done." Ethan stood up, walked to the window, stood there. He felt the grief the way you feel it when it comes back, not as something new, but as something that had only been dormant. The same shape and weight as before, just moved to a different location in your body for a while. He felt it, and he felt, alongside it, something that might become anger if he let it, and something else that was harder to name. The specific devastation of realizing that the person you lost had been carrying something alone that they shouldn't have had to carry alone, had been protecting you from an unfinished truth, had died mid-sentence. "She didn't tell me," he said. "She was protecting you," Nora said quietly. "She was always—" He stopped, put his hand flat on the glass. "She was always doing that, deciding what I could handle." It came out rougher than he intended, not anger at Nora, at Claire, at anyone in particular, just grief finding its edges. "I could have handled it. I know." Nora set down her cup. "I think she knew that too. She wanted to give you answers, not more questions. She wanted to have the whole thing finished first. A pause. That was Claire. He turned around, looked at his sister-in-law, who had been sitting with this for months, carrying it because she'd understood correctly that delivering it would do damage that couldn't be undone. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to decide whether you want to find out," she said. There's a possibility that what she found leads nowhere, that it was a tragedy without a culpable error. But there's also a possibility. She stopped, started again. "You have a right to know. Liam has a right to know. But it's your decision. I'm not pushing you either way." He nodded once. He didn't sleep that night. I was still in the living room at 4 a.m. when the harbor began to gray with early light. The tea Nora had left for him long cold on the table. The room unchanged and the world completely different. He did not call Ava. He wanted to. He was aware that he wanted to, that the instinct to reach for her was strong enough to notice. But this was not a thing he could bring to someone else before he'd even begun to understand it himself. This was grief and guilt and a reopened door to a room he had spent 3 years boarding up, and he needed to be alone with it before he could be anything to anyone. At 5 in the morning, he went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Liam's room. His son was asleep on his back, one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit, his face completely relaxed. The hall light was on, as always. Liam's drawings were pinned to the corkboard above his desk. The spaceship with the soccer goal, a drawing of the harbor, a picture that was apparently Ethan, but looked, to be honest, more like a rectangle with hair. Ethan leaned against the doorframe and looked at his son for a long time. He thought about the pregnancy they'd lost before Liam. He thought about how Claire had handled that grief, quietly, internally, with the characteristic steadiness that had sometimes been her great strength and sometimes left her alone with things she shouldn't have been alone with. He thought about the years she'd apparently spent trying to find an answer, scheduling appointments, tracing records, writing letters she never sent. He thought about how he had not known any of it, how she had smiled at him over dinners and talked about the future and helped plan Liam's 3rd birthday party while carrying this investigation, this unfinished story, this wound she was trying to heal in secret before she showed it to him. And then the cab in February, and the hospital, and the room going very quiet, and all the unfinished things left behind. Liam made a small sound in his sleep, shifted, settled. Ethan pushed off the door frame and went back downstairs. He called the name Nora had given him at 8 a.m. A medical attorney in Cambridge, a woman named Dr. Pauline Chen, who had worked in medical negligence for 20 years and had, apparently, been the person Claire had been planning to meet. He left a voicemail. He called Derek Holt and said he was going to need to cancel his week. He called Marcus and said he was handling a family matter, which Marcus received with the professional discretion of a man who had worked with Ethan long enough to ask no questions. Then he called Ava. She picked up immediately, which told him she'd been awake, possibly waiting. "Hey," she said. "Is everything okay?" He paused. "No." A beat. "Tell me," he told her. "Not everything at once. It came in pieces, the way things come when you've been awake for 30 hours and you're trying to be coherent and precise about something that is neither coherent nor precise. Nora's visit, the letters, the earlier pregnancy, the investigation Claire had been quietly running, the appointment scheduled with the attorney. Ava listened through all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the silence on the line lasted long enough that he almost said her name. Then she said, "I'm so sorry." "I don't know what I'm feeling," he said. "I don't know if I'm angry or just, I keep thinking she was alone with it. For a year she was alone with it." "She was trying to take care of you," Ava said carefully. I know that. It doesn't," he exhaled. "It doesn't stop the feeling." "No, it doesn't." Another silence. "I need to," he stopped, started again. "I need some time to work through this, to find out what there is to find out. I don't know how long that takes." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay. I'm not," he pressed his hand over his eyes. "I'm not pulling away from you. I want to be clear about that. This isn't about Ethan." Her voice was gentle and firm in equal measure. "You don't have to explain yourself to me. Go do what you need to do." "Ava, I mean it." A pause. "I'm here. That doesn't change. Go." He held the phone for a moment after she said it, feeling the particular combination of gratitude and inadequacy that comes from being genuinely taken care of when you're not sure you deserve it. "Thank you," he said. "Stop thanking me. Go." He went. The investigation took 6 weeks. Dr. Pauline Chen was a thorough and unsentimental woman who had seen enough medical negligence cases to have an accurate understanding of what warranted pursuing and what didn't, and she spent the first 2 weeks going through every record Nora had and every record Claire had accumulated before her death. The process was slow and detailed and deeply unpleasant in the way that any formal excavation of a personal tragedy is unpleasant. Everything that had been grief became also paperwork, became also dates and clinical language and the clinical flatness of medical records that reduced some of the worst days of his life to checkboxes and notations. Ethan flew to Portland to speak to the retired doctor in person. The meeting lasted 3 hours and was the hardest 3 hours he'd had in years. Not because the man was defensive or evasive, actually almost the opposite. An aging man in his 70s who had spent years since retiring thinking about a particular case and who broke down, partway through, in the specific way of someone who has been waiting to be asked to account for something, and is both relieved and destroyed that the moment has finally come. Hunt flew home that night, sat in the back of the car from the airport, and looked out the window at the city lights, and felt hollowed out in a way that was different from grief. More like resolution. The particular exhaustion of a thing that has been unfinished finally reaching its end. It had been an error, not malicious, not criminal in any actionable sense. Too much time had passed. The statute of limitations was complex. Dr. Chen was clear-eyed about what could and could not be pursued legally. But it had been an error, a misread result, a delayed referral, a chain of small failures that had led to a loss that might have been prevented. The night he got back from Portland, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the file Dr. Chen had compiled and thought about Claire. Not the version of Claire from the difficult years, the grief-adjacent version, but the earlier one. The woman who had done impressions of his board members in their Charlestown apartment. The one who laughed from her stomach and was wickedly funny and had decided, alone, to find an answer to an unanswerable thing before she handed it to him. He thought she would have found it. She was almost there. He put the file down. He thought about Ava. In the 6 weeks since Nora's visit, Ava had done exactly what she'd said she would do. She'd been there, steadily and without performance, in the particular way of someone who has decided not to demand anything and means it. She'd texted him, not every day. She understood the difference between being present and being wait. She'd checked in about Liam and asked practical questions and twice sent him things she'd found funny, which was its own kind of care because it meant she was still treating him like a person and not a tragedy. She had not come to the house. She had not pushed her way into the middle of it. She'd stayed at the edge, visible and available, letting him move toward her at his own pace. He had missed her badly enough that it sat in his chest like something physical. But he had also, and this took him longer to admit to himself, alone in the car from Portland, been afraid. Not of her, of the particular terror of having found something worth having again, while simultaneously being reminded, in the most visceral possible way, of exactly what it felt like to lose something worth having. The grief had come back full force. He'd managed it. He'd sat in it. But alongside the grief was the voice that said, "You built something again, and look what happened. You let something matter, and it was gone in a cab on a winter night with no warning and no preparation." He knew what that voice was. He knew it was not wisdom, just fear dressed up as wisdom, which was fear at its most dangerous. He'd spent a week arguing with it. He was done arguing. But was also, he realized on the drive from the airport, done being someone who processed everything alone and called it strength. He called Ava from the car. It was late, past 11, the city streaming past the windows. She answered on the third ring, her voice slightly thick with sleep. "Ethan? Are you okay?" "I'm in the car from the airport. I just got back from Portland." He paused. "I know it's late. I wanted to hear your voice." A beat. Then, softer. "How are you?" "Tired." He looked out the window. I think it's done. Or as done as it's going to be. I'll tell you everything. Not tonight, but soon." "Okay?" She was quiet for a moment. "How's Liam?" "He's with Margaret. He's fine. He's been asking about you." A pause. "I've been asking about you. Internally. To myself. For 6 weeks." She was quiet long enough that he thought maybe the line had dropped. Then, "Ethan, you need to sleep." I know. We can talk tomorrow. I know. He paused. I owe you an apology. You really don't. I went quiet on you. I know that's not what I said I was going to do. I said I wasn't pulling away, and then You were working through something real, she said, firmly, but not unkindly. I understood that. Still, Ethan. And there it was. That quality in her voice that he'd been missing for 6 weeks. The specific steadiness of it. The way she said his name like she meant exactly him. Not the CEO, not the grieving widower, not any of the versions he wore for the rest of the world. Stop apologizing and go home and sleep. Okay, he said, and buy orange juice. Liam told me you were out again. He laughed. A short surprise sound, the same surprise quality as the first time she'd made him laugh in the conference room, back when everything was different. He told you that? He texted me, she said, 3 days ago. He texted you. He found my number in your phone. I can explain why that's fine, or we can just acknowledge it and move on. I'm going to choose the second thing, Ethan said. Good choice. He leaned his head back against the seat. Outside, Boston moved past in its winter nighttime way. The bridges, the waterfront, the particular skyline that he'd looked at from every possible angle over 30 years of his life, and still hadn't stopped finding beautiful. Ava, he said. Yeah, I know what I want. He said it plainly, with the simplicity of a man who has spent 6 weeks walking through fire and has come out the other side with fewer complications than he went in with. In case that wasn't clear before, I want to be specific about it. She was quiet for a moment. We'll talk tomorrow, she said. Her voice was different now. Not the efficient steadiness of earlier, something underneath it that was trying to stay calm and not entirely succeeding. Tomorrow, he agreed. Get home safe. He did. He walked into the house at 11:45, standing alone in the front hallway with the lights off. The harbor visible through the back windows, the house quiet in all its rooms. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the past 6 weeks, and the weight of everything before that, and then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He let it be enough that he was here. That the house was standing and his son was safe, and he was standing in it with his whole life still in front of him. He went upstairs, stood in Liam's doorway. The hall light was on. He stood there until the hollowed-out feeling passed and something warmer took its place. Then he went to bed. He slept for 10 hours. In the morning, he made pancakes, acceptable, per Liam's established assessment, and bought orange juice, and called Ava at 10 a.m. like he said he would. The conversation lasted 2 hours. He told her everything. Portland, the doctor, the records, what had been an error and what had not, and what closure meant when it wasn't resolution, just the absence of unanswered questions. He told her about Claire's letters. He told her about sitting in the car from the airport thinking about fear and what it masquerades as. Ava listened to all of it. At the end, she said, "She sounds like someone who loved you very hard." She did, he said. She also kept too much to herself. People do. You don't, he said. She laughed softly. I'm learning not to. A pause. It's a process. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to see you today. Okay? Not for a conversation, not to talk through everything. Just, he thought about how to say it. I want to make dinner and have Liam show you something he's been working on at school. And I want you to argue with me about something unimportant, and I want to... He stopped. I've missed the regular. Is that strange? No, Ava said, and her voice had the quality of someone smiling at a phone screen. That's not strange at all. She arrived at 6 with wine that she'd selected more confidently this time, and Liam met her at the door and told her he had something important to show her, and she said, let's see it, and they went inside. The house was warm and slightly chaotic with the aftermath of Ethan's attempt at an actual dinner, and there was flour on the kitchen counter from something that had apparently gone wrong and been resolved. And Liam's something important turned out to be a new drawing in which the astronaut soccer player figure had been given a companion, a smaller figure with dark hair who Liam had labeled, in careful block letters, AVA. She stood there looking at it for a moment. It's your character, Liam explained, with the serious generosity of a child presenting something they've made. For the plan. Because you're part of the plan now. Ava looked at the drawing. At the small figure with dark hair standing next to the spacesuit on Mars, next to the soccer goal floating in the atmosphere, 2 figures inside a child's enormous and uncomplicated certainty about who belonged in his world. She looked up. Ethan was leaning in the kitchen doorway, watching her. His expression was the same one she'd seen in the car that first November afternoon, cracked open, unguarded, more than smiling. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She looked back at the drawing. I'm honored, she told Liam, very seriously. It's a very good plan. Liam nodded. I know, he said. That's why I added you. The new year came in quietly at the waterfront house. There was no party, no champagne countdown with a crowd of people. Just Ethan and Ava and Liam on the back porch at 11:58, wrapped in blankets. Liam between them drinking apple juice from a plastic cup with the serious ceremonial awareness of a child who understands that something important is happening and has decided to treat it accordingly. The harbor reflected the city lights in long broken lines, and somewhere across the water there were fireworks going off over the financial district, small bright bursts of color that Liam narrated with the enthusiasm of a sports commentator. That one's red. That one's almost purple. Is that purple, Ava? That's purple adjacent, she said. What does that mean? Trying to be purple, getting close. He considered this with absolute seriousness. I think it's purple. I'll defer to you. Ethan was watching the two of them more than he was watching the fireworks. He had a blanket around his shoulders and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he was thinking about the year behind them. The October storm, the laptop, the floor, the harbor lunches, Nora's visit, Portland, all of it. And about the year ahead, which felt, for the first time in a long time, like something he wanted to move toward rather than just endure. At midnight, Liam held up his apple juice with tremendous gravity. Happy New Year, he announced. Happy New Year, they said, and Ava tapped her glass against his, and Liam made the sound of a crowd cheering, which he provided himself. Ethan looked at Ava over the top of Liam's head. She looked back at him. The fireworks were still going over the harbor, purple adjacent and otherwise, and she had her blanket pulled up to her chin and her cheeks were cold pink, and she was smiling at him in the uncomplicated way she'd only recently started doing, without the careful management underneath it, without the professional distance or the waiting for the other shoe, just smiling, directly, at him. He leaned across and kissed her. Not long, not dramatic, just present. His hand briefly against the side of her face, her cold cheek, and her small surprised intake of breath that became something warmer. Liam, to his eternal credit, made a sound of absolute disgust and looked away toward the fireworks, which was exactly the correct 6-year-old response and made both of them laugh against each other's mouths. Gross, Liam said to the harbor. Yeah, Ethan agreed, probably. Liam shot him a look of profound betrayal at the lack of remorse, and Ava was laughing too hard to be diplomatic about it, and the three of them stood there on the back porch in the January cold while the city celebrated the turning of the year, and it was imperfect and cold and slightly absurd, and it was the best New Year Ethan had had in years. January moved fast the way January always does when you're not waiting for it to be over. Ava's team delivered a risk analysis in the third week that saved Sinclair Global from a significant exposure in the emerging market sector, a potential loss that Marcus Chen, reviewing the numbers afterward, estimated in the range of $11 to $14 million. He walked into Ethan's office with the analysis in his hand and set it on the desk and said, with the careful neutrality that was his most expensive professional skill, "She's very good." I know, Ethan said. The board is going to start noticing. Good. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then, you're happy. He said it like a diagnosis, not unkind, just precise. Ethan looked up from his desk. Is that a problem? It's just notable. Marcus picked up the analysis. It's been a while since you were notable for that. He headed for the door and then stopped, which was not his usual style. For what it's worth, I liked her from the beginning. The Morrison Klein presentation. I thought... He paused, apparently decided to just say it. I thought, this is someone who's been waiting for a door. She just needed someone to open it. Ethan thought about that after Marcus left. About doors and who opens them. About all the ways the story of the previous 3 months could have gone differently. If it had been any other Friday night, any other CEO, any other assistant who hadn't forgotten a laptop in the rain. He'd stopped thinking about the near misses. They got you nowhere. He thought instead about the harbor lunch and the bakery and the soccer field and the New Year's kiss and the drawing on Liam's corkboard with the small, dark-haired figure labeled AVA. And he thought, whatever it was that put her at that door in the rain, I'll take it. The complications came in February. Not catastrophically. Not all at once. More the way things get complicated when something private becomes incrementally less private. When the world around two people starts to notice and starts to have opinions, and the opinions find their way back to you through the specific grapevine that exists in every professional environment, no matter how much HR discourages it. The first was a piece in a Boston business publication. Small, a gossip column item, barely 4 sentences, noting that Ethan Sinclair had been seen at a family-friendly diner in Cambridge with a child and a young woman. The item was careful enough not to name her, which was something, but it existed, and people in the Sinclair Global building read it and did what people in professional environments always do with that kind of information. They quietly assembled it alongside everything else they'd been noticing and drew conclusions. Ava heard about it from a colleague on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the particular form of sympathy that is really just rubbernecking in professional clothing. She thanked the colleague for telling her and went back to her desk and sat there for a moment, feeling the specific exposure of being looked at in a way she hadn't chosen. She called Ethan at lunch. "I saw it," he said before she finished explaining. "Okay." She kept her voice flat. "I want to know how you want to handle it. I've already talked to legal. There's nothing actionable. It doesn't name you." "That's not what I'm asking." She paused. "I'm asking whether you want to handle it by pulling back. Publicly. To make it cleaner." A silence. "No," he said, with a flatness that matched hers. "I don't want to pull back." "Ethan, I'm not ashamed of this," he said. "I'm not going to act like I am." A beat. "Are you?" She thought about it honestly. About Meridian Street and the 4 years of being invisible in that building, and the promotion that had come through work, and the independent reporting line, and all the things that were genuinely hers, not borrowed from proximity. She thought about Sophie's drawings, and Dana's voice cracking on the phone when she'd heard about the promotion, and the woman at the Roxbury bakery who still knew her order. "No," she said, "I'm not." "Then we handle it by continuing to do our jobs well and being exactly what we are, and letting the gossip run out of material." His voice softened slightly. "You've worked for everything you have here. Everybody with access to the actual numbers knows that. The people who want to make it about something else, they'll make it about something else regardless of what we do." She exhaled slowly. "I know. So, she agreed. A pause. "I hate this part. I know. It'll pass." It didn't entirely pass, but it changed shape. The gossip column item was followed by nothing, because there was nothing to follow it. Ava's work continued to be the kind of work that was hard to argue with in numbers, and the numbers were the language that mattered in Sinclair Global's world. By the end of February, most of what was circulating in the building had shifted from speculation about their relationship to a more general recalibration of how people thought about her professionally, which was, in the end, the correction that had always mattered more. Gregory Walsh left the company in mid-February, which was his decision, and everyone treated it as unrelated to everything. And it was not entirely unrelated to everything, but that was a thing that went unspoken by mutual agreement. The second complication was harder. It arrived in the form of a woman named Diana Hartwell, who had been part of Ethan's world in the months after Claire died, briefly, badly, in the way of two grieving people who had reached for each other in the dark, and found it didn't help. They'd ended things by mutual acknowledgement before they'd begun in any meaningful way. He hadn't thought about her in 18 months. She called him in late February, which was her right, and asked if they could have coffee, which was also her right, and he agreed because he had no reason not to, and because he was a person who tried to be decent even when things were complicated. He told Ava about it before it happened. She was sitting on the couch in her apartment. He'd been there, they'd been having dinner, and he'd told her after the dishes were done in the slightly clinical way you tell someone something you know is going to land badly and are trying to be honest about anyway. Ava looked at him for a long moment after he finished. "Okay," she said. "Okay? You're telling me beforehand. You're not hiding it." She picked up her tea. "She's someone from before. You're allowed to have a coffee with someone from before." He looked at her. "That's it? What else is there?" She held his gaze. "Are you telling me because you want my permission, or because you want me to know?" "The second one," he said. "Then you have it. I know." She shrugged, with the careful steadiness she deployed when she was managing something and was determined not to make it someone else's problem. "Go have coffee," Be decent about it. Come home. He noticed the word. Home. The way she said it without flagging it, the way it just came out, embedded in the sentence like it had always been there. He didn't flag it either, but he held it. The coffee with Diana lasted 40 minutes. She looked good, more settled than she'd been in the difficult period after Claire, less lost. She'd moved to New York for a year and come back. She was seeing someone, she said. She'd mostly called because she felt she owed him an apology for some of the things she'd said in the ending of their brief, broken attempt. Harsh things, said from a place of her own pain that she'd since understood better. He told her there was nothing to apologize for. He meant it. She asked, toward the end, with the specific, careful precision of a woman who has decided to ask a direct question. Are you happy? He thought about New Year's Eve on the porch, about Liam and the drawing, about Ava saying come home. Yes, he said. I think I actually am. Diana nodded once, looked at her coffee cup. Good, she said, and she meant it, and that was the end of it. I went home and told Ava, sitting in the kitchen of the waterfront house while Liam ate cereal at the table and provided his periodic commentary on the television visible from the living room, and Ava listened and nodded and asked no complicated questions, and that was also the end of it. It was a Wednesday in late February, almost 4 months since Nora's visit, almost 5 months since the night with the laptop, when the thing that had been building without announcement between Ethan and the word future finally arrived. I was in his office at 8:30 at night, which was not unusual. Ava had left at 7. Her team had a deadline, and she'd been pulling long days, and she'd stopped by his office to say goodnight. And he'd looked up from the contract on his desk and looked at her standing in his doorway and thought, I want this for the rest of my life. Not as a revelation, more as a recognition, the feeling of catching up to something your heart already knows. He'd been circling it for weeks, maybe longer. He'd been letting himself get close to it and then finding a reason to keep a small distance. The old reflex of a man who had learned that loving things completely was also signing up to lose them completely. But she was standing in his doorway with her coat on and her laptop bag over her shoulder, and she was tired in the specific way of someone who has been building something with their whole self. And she said, "Don't stay too late," in the voice she used when she meant it but wasn't going to push, and then she left. And he sat in his office for another 2 hours not reading the contract. I was thinking about Liam's drawing, about the small dark-haired figure labeled AVA standing on Mars next to the soccer goal, placed there with the total certainty of a child who makes these decisions without all the scaffolding adults build around them. He was thinking about what Liam had said, because you're part of the plan now. He was thinking about the plan. He called Derek Holt the next morning and asked him to find someone. Not a name he had, a jeweler, specifically, one who did custom work. Not the kind of place that sold the standard expensive symbols of wealth, but the kind of place where someone actually sat down with you and asked what you were trying to say. Derek, to his credit, only paused for about 2 seconds before he said, I know someone. I'll send you the address. The jeweler was a woman named Rosalie Park, who worked out of a small studio in the South End that had the atmosphere of a place built for serious decisions. She was 60, direct, and had zero interest in showing him the displays before she asked him several questions that were so personal he almost stood up and left, and then understood when he started answering them that they were exactly the right questions. What was she like? Not what did she look like, not what did she do, what was she like? He talked for 20 minutes. Rosalie listened and made 2 notes and then said, I know what you want. She sketched something on a pad. He looked at it. Not the typical thing, she said. Something that feels like her. Not ostentatious. Something that says, found rather than bought. He looked at the sketch for a long time. Yes, he said. Exactly that. 6 weeks, Rosalie said, and I'll need you to come back twice to look at the work in progress. These decisions shouldn't be made in one sitting. He came back twice. He brought Liam on the second visit, which was either a brilliant idea or a logistical disaster, and turned out to be somewhere in the middle. Liam spent most of it examining every item in the studio with the careful attention of a junior archaeologist, and asked Rosalie if she could make a ring for Captain the Rabbit, which she handled with great composure. But when Ethan showed Liam the piece in progress, sitting on the workbench in its unfinished state, the stone deep and quiet, the setting still taking shape, and asked him, What do you think? Liam looked at it for a long moment. It looks like her, he said. That was enough. It wasn't a plan that Ethan executed with precision or perfect timing, because he was not, despite the professional image, a man who managed the things that mattered to him with precision. He tended to be impulsive when he actually cared about something, and overthought it afterward rather than before, which was the pattern of his entire emotional life and probably not going to change. He'd thought about scenarios. A proper dinner, maybe. Somewhere significant. A plan. He'd run through it in his head several times, and each time it felt like a set piece from someone else's life. Too staged, too performed, wrong for who they were. What happened instead was a Tuesday in late March. Ava was leaving the Sinclair Global building at 9:15 at night, which was not unusual for this time of the quarter. The lobby was mostly empty. The night security guard, a man named Luis, who had been there for 11 years and who Ava had taken the trouble to actually learn the name of, which he had apparently told 3 other people about, waved her out. She pushed through the glass door onto the street. Ethan was standing outside. Not formally. Not arranged. He was standing on the sidewalk in his jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had left his own building 20 minutes ago and decided not to go home yet, which was essentially what had happened. Ava stopped. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "Waiting for you." He said it simply, like it required no more explanation than that. She looked at him. He looked exhausted in the bone-deep way that had been accumulating for weeks. The end of a difficult quarter, the Portland trip still metabolizing, all the weight of a life that had a lot in it. But he was looking at her with the specific, direct quality she'd come to know, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd decided not to manage. "Walk with me," he said. They walked along the waterfront. The March night was cold, the harbor choppy and dark, the city quiet in the way it gets late on weeknights when most of the world has already decided it's done for the day. Their shoulders were close but not touching, the familiar rhythm of people who have been walking together long enough to match their pace without thinking about it. Ethan started talking, and it came out the way his most honest things did. Not in a prepared speech, not structured, just accumulating. He talked about the year, about October and the rain and standing at her door with a laptop, which now felt like standing at the door of a different life without knowing it. About the conference room and the lunch at Harborlight and Liam in the bakery with 8 marshmallows. About the fear. He called it what it was, directly, without dressing it up. The specific terror of wanting something again after understanding what loss felt like from the inside. About Portland and the retired doctor and the long night after, and what he'd understood about himself in the weeks that followed. He talked about Liam, about the drawing, about the place setting at Thanksgiving and the hand-holding on the sidewalk, and all the ways his son had been, in his uncomplicated 6-year-old certainty, faster and braver about this than his own father. "He already knows," Ethan said. "He doesn't have the vocabulary for it, but he knows. You've been part of our life since November, and he's built you into the architecture of it. The plan." He paused. "I have too." Ava was listening. The harbor moved beside them, cold and real. "I'm not good at doing this without a safety net," he continued. "I told you that. I've been building one, I think, checking that everything is solid before I say anything, which is very practical, and also, Ava, extremely stupid, because nothing about this is solid, nothing about anything is solid, and the past year has reminded me of that more than I needed reminding." She stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to face her. They were on a stretch of the waterfront path where the city lights reflected in long ripples on the harbor, and the wind was in her hair, and she was looking at him with an expression that was doing a lot of things at once. "I've been broken in specific ways," he said. "I know that. The grief and the guilt and the months I spent inside the company instead of inside my own life. I know what that's done to me, and I'm still working on it, and I'll probably be working on it for a while. I'm not offering you a finished person." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm offering you the actual person, the whole thing, whatever that's worth." She opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," he said. He put his hand in his jacket pocket, brought out a small dark blue box. Rosalie had packed it without ceremony, in a box that looked like it meant business. "I wasn't planning to do this on a sidewalk at 9:30 at night after you've been working for 12 hours. I had more of a plan than this. But I've been standing out here for 20 minutes, and you walked through that door, and I couldn't wait anymore." He opened the box. She looked at it. The ring was exactly what Rosalie had made it. Not the typical thing, not the obvious symbol. A deep blue-green stone, the color of the harbor in afternoon light, set simply, in a way that looked found rather than bought. like it had always existed and was only now being given to the right person. Ava stared at it. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are, Ethan said. I'm not asking you to fit into a life that was built without you. I'm asking you to help build something new, different from what either of us has had before. He paused. I'm asking you to be ours, mine and Liam's. His voice, which had been steadier than he had any right to, shifted on the last sentence, just slightly, the real thing showing through. He's going to be insufferable about this. I want you to know that going in. A sound came out of Ava that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was probably some emergency combination of both. She pressed her hand over her mouth. You can say no, he said. If the timing is wrong, or if you need more time, or if I've pushed this faster than Ethan. Her voice was unsteady and she took it back, steadied it. Would you stop giving me an exit every time you do something brave? He looked at her. She was crying. She hadn't decided to, and she wasn't doing it dramatically. Just the specific kind of crying that happens when something you've been braced against finally stops coming and you feel the removal of the pressure all at once. I grew up waiting for things to fall apart, she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. I told you that. I spent 30 years expecting the floor to go out, and I kept waiting for this. She gestured slightly helplessly between them. I kept waiting for the version where this was something that happened to someone else and not to me, where I was the person watching from the outside, because that was the version I knew. He was very still. But you sat on my floor, she said, with Sophie, in the rain, and then you kept being real. You were tired, and you were grieving, and you made bad decisions sometimes, and you didn't know what to do with orange juice, and you were just real. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I love you. I've been not saying it for months because I was waiting for it to go wrong, but it keeps not going wrong. She looked at the ring in the open box. So yes, obviously yes. How was that a question? He looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, I love you too. I should have said that first. You did it backwards, she agreed. I do most things backwards. I know, I'm used to it. I took the ring from the box with slightly unsteady hands, and she gave him her hand and he put it on her finger, and it fit, because Rosalie Park had asked him the right questions and he had answered them honestly, and the ring looked exactly like what it was, something made for a specific person, irreplaceable and particular. They stood there on the waterfront, in the March cold, with the harbor moving beside them. She looked at the ring on her hand. He looked at her, looking at it. He's really going to be insufferable, she said. Completely, Ethan agreed. He's been asking me about it for 3 weeks. She looked up. He knew? He asked me in February when I was going to ask you. He said, and I'm quoting directly, you should probably do it before she thinks you changed your mind. Ava started laughing. The real kind. No management in it. Head slightly back, shoulders moving. He's 6, she said. He's an old soul, Ethan said. It's alarming. She was still laughing when he pulled her in, his arms around her on the cold sidewalk, and she stopped laughing and put her face against his shoulder, and he held her there on the waterfront in the March wind, while the harbor went on doing what harbors do, moving, cold, constant, indifferent to everything, and somehow the perfect backdrop for it anyway. I'm scared, she said, into his shoulder. Honest, as always. Me too, he said, into her hair. Good. She lifted her head. Good? Scared keeps you honest. He looked at her. You told me that. She stared at him. I said that 4 months ago. I remember things. She shook her head slowly, with the expression of a woman who has signed up for a lifetime of being quoted back to herself, which was the accurate picture of what she'd agreed to, and she was fine with it. We need to tell him tonight, she said. I know. He's at Margaret's. It's 10 o'clock. She stays up late. She'll want to know. Ava looked at him. You already called her, didn't you? I called her before I came outside to wait. She stared at him for a long moment. You were that certain? He held her gaze. I've been certain since November. He paused. I was just getting the rest of me to catch up. She looked at the ring again. At the harbor. At the man standing in front of her who was tired and imperfect and had run out of reasons to be afraid and had come to find her on a sidewalk at 9:30 at night with a box in his pocket rather than wait one more day. Okay, she said. Their shorthand. I'm here. I'm choosing this. Let's go. They called Liam from the car. Margaret answered first, because Liam was already asleep. But Margaret's response to the news was warm enough to wake him. A sound of genuine joy from a woman who had watched Ethan Sinclair navigate 3 years of grief and had been, quietly, hoping for this specific phone call. Liam's voice came on a minute later, thick with sleep, and slightly confused about why he'd been woken up, and Ethan said, "I asked Ava something tonight." And there was a pause, then very awake suddenly. "What did she say?" "She said yes." The sound that came out of him at that moment was not a word. It was something more fundamental than a word, pure, uncomplicated triumph, the sound of a child whose plan has come together exactly as intended. Ava was laughing again in the passenger seat, her hand over her mouth, the harbor-colored ring catching the car's interior light. "I knew it," Liam announced, to everyone and no one. I told you ages ago." "You did," Ethan agreed. "You were right. I'm usually right. Don't push it. Can she come get me now? It's 10 o'clock. But I want to see the ring." "Tomorrow, buddy." A silence of profound but temporary disappointment. Then, "Okay, but early." "Early," Ethan promised. They hung up. The car moved through the quiet city. Ava's hand was in Ethan's on the center console, and neither of them was talking, just existing in the specific warmth of a thing that has been decided and can't be undecided and doesn't need to be. The harbor was dark outside the windows, and the city was almost asleep, and somewhere across it Liam was lying in his bed at Margaret's house, with Captain the Rabbit, and the absolute satisfaction of a 6-year-old who has been correct about something important. The plan was coming together. He'd known all along it would. Liam came early, 6:53 in the morning, to be precise, which Ethan registered through the fog of sleep as the sound of small feet on hardwood floors, and then the particular weight of a 7-year-old landing on the edge of his bed with the subtlety of a small earthquake. "Is she here yet?" Ethan opened one eye. "It's 6:53. You said early." "I meant human early." Liam considered this. He was in his pajamas, Captain tucked under one arm, his hair doing the specific morning thing it did, where one side was flat and the other was architectural. He looked at his father with the expression of someone who has been awake for at least an hour and has been patient about it for as long as he intends to be. "Can we call her?" "No." "Why?" "Because she also needs to sleep." "But she said yes last night." "That doesn't change her need for sleep." Liam looked at him for a long moment, recalibrating. Then he climbed fully onto the bed, pulled the blanket over himself, and lay there staring at the ceiling with the focused energy of a child who has decided to wait, but wants you to know how much it's costing him. Ethan lay there beside him in the quiet of the early morning, the harbor just visible through the curtains going gray with the early light, and thought, "This is a thing I want to do for the rest of my life. Lie here in the morning with this kid who has never once in his life let me be miserable for longer than he could stand, and wait for a woman with a harbor-colored ring on her hand to come through the front door." He fell back asleep. Liam did not. At 8:15, the doorbell rang, and the sound of Liam descending the stairs at speed was something between a herd of medium-sized animals and a controlled avalanche. Ethan heard the front door, heard Ava's voice saying something he couldn't make out, heard Liam's response, which was immediate and comprehensive, and involved the word ring approximately 4 times in the first sentence. He got up, put on coffee, stood in the kitchen in yesterday's clothes and listened to the sound of his son and his future wife talking in the front hallway, and felt the specific morning-light quality of a life that had turned out better than he'd planned. Better, actually, than he'd known to plan for. Ava came into the kitchen with Liam attached to her left hand, examining the ring with the focused attention of a jeweler's apprentice. She looked at Ethan. Her hair was still slightly damp from her shower, and she was in jeans and a sweater. And she had the ring on her finger, and she was here at 8:15 in the morning, and she looked entirely real and entirely herself. "He's been awake for 2 hours, Ethan said. "I know. He told me." She sat down at the kitchen table, Liam beside her still holding her hand up to the window light. "He also told me you said he couldn't call me. For the record, he could have called me." It was 6:53. "I was already up." She looked at him over the top of Liam's head. "I couldn't sleep either." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning light came through the kitchen window over the harbor and landed on the table between them, and everything was imperfect and ordinary and exactly right. "Coffee?" he said. "Please." Liam finally set her hand down with the satisfied expression of a man who has completed a thorough inspection. It looks like the harbor, he announced. That's what I thought, Ava said. Dad picked it. Your dad picked it. Liam looked at Ethan with an expression of surprised approval, as though this exceeded his established expectations for his father's taste. Good job, he said, with genuine generosity. Ethan poured the coffee. Thank you, Liam. You're welcome. Liam slid off his chair and headed for the living room, apparently satisfied that the important business of the morning had been concluded. I'm going to watch something. Breakfast first, Ethan said. After. Before. A pause from the doorway. Fine. He came back and sat down. The negotiation concluded with the pragmatism of a child who knows which battles he can win before 8:30. They ate breakfast, the three of them, at the kitchen table with the harbor outside the window and the morning news on low in the other room, and Liam eating cereal with a level of focused concentration that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. Ava drank her coffee, and Ethan ate toast. He'd made pancakes twice this week already, and there were limits, and they talked about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of conversation. This was the thing, Ava thought, that nobody prepared you for. Not the big moments, not the proposal on the waterfront, or the Thanksgiving dinner, or the New Year's kiss. The thing nobody told you about was breakfast. The ordinary Tuesday morningness of people who have chosen each other, sitting at a table eating cereal and toast, and being just there. Consistently, unremarkably, solidly there. She had spent a long time not believing this was something she was allowed to have. She was working on believing it. The engagement lasted 6 months, which was shorter than some people expected and longer than Liam thought was strictly necessary. He asked, in April, why they couldn't just do it now, and the explanation involving planning and family and logistics left him visibly unpersuaded but tolerantly accepting. In those 6 months, several things happened. The first was that Ava moved, not into the waterfront house, not yet, but out of the apartment on Meridian Street and into a place in Charlestown. A 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor with windows that actually sealed against the cold, and a view of the harbor from a different angle, close enough to the waterfront house, to make the eventual transition feel less like a leap and more like a series of manageable steps. Donna helped her move on, a Saturday in April with Sophie, supervising from the couch she'd claimed immediately upon arrival, declaring it the best couch I've ever sat on, which was both sweet and a slightly damning assessment of the furniture situation on Meridian Street. Ethan came with Liam in the afternoon with boxes and food, and the 4 of them, 5, counting Sophie, ate pizza on the floor of the half-unpacked apartment, while Liam and Sophie argued companionably about which cartoon was better. And Ethan put together a bookshelf with the focused determination of a man who had never assembled flat-pack furniture and was not going to admit it. The instructions say step 4 goes before step 3, Ava said from behind him. The instructions are wrong. The instructions are from the manufacturer. The manufacturer, Ethan said with great dignity, has not accounted for the specific configuration of this room. Dana caught Ava's eye from across the room. Dana's expression said, clearly and without words, this is your life now. Ava's expression said equally clearly, I know, I chose it. The bookshelf turned out fine. One of the back panels was slightly warped, but it stood and it held books, which were the 2 primary requirements. The second thing that happened in those 6 months was that Ava's career continued to build itself into something she would not have recognized from the vantage point of Meridian Street 4 years earlier. Her team closed 2 major accounts, both sourced through analysis she'd led. In May, the board of Sinclair Global formally acknowledged her division as a key driver of the company's best quarterly performance in 3 years, which was noted in the shareholder letter in language that was corporate and dry, and which nonetheless made Marcus Chen smile in a way he would have denied if asked. Patricia Reeves from Morrison Klein called again. This time, instead of a consulting request, she offered Ava a board advisory position with her own firm, a part-time independent role that sat completely outside Sinclair Global's structure, and would be, as Patricia put it with the directness of a woman who respected directness, yours. Nothing to do with anyone else, just yours. Ava said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 1 day and then called Patricia back and said yes. She told Ethan that she'd been slightly nervous about it. Not about his reaction, she knew his reaction, but about the particular vulnerability of saying out loud, I'm building something that isn't connected to you. Of asserting to the man she was going to marry that she needed a part of her life that was fully her own. She didn't need to be nervous. He looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression that was straightforward pride, no complications in it. Good, he said. You're not Ava. He looked at her steadily. The thing I love about you is not that you need me, it's that you chose me. There's a difference. He paused. Take the position. Build the thing. Be someone who doesn't need Ethan Sinclair's name to open a door. She stared at him for a moment. You're better at this than you think you are, she said. I have good instincts and terrible execution. The instincts are getting better. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The execution is also getting better, she said. The third thing that happened was harder to categorize. It happened gradually, across the 6 months, in the quiet accumulation of time spent together, the way a family doesn't announce itself so much as simply become, through repetition and presence, and the 1,000 small acts of people deciding, over and over, that this is where they belong. Liam stopped asking if Ava was coming over, because the answer was consistently yes, and eventually the question became unnecessary. He started putting her in his stories at school, not dramatically, just naturally, the way children include the geography of their real life in the things they make up. He drew her into the margins of his notebooks. He told Mrs. Okafor with great casualness that Ava explained it to me when he answered a math problem correctly, and Mrs. Okafor, who had watched this child navigate loss and change for 2 years, called Ethan that evening, not because there was a problem, but because she wanted him to know. He seems settled, she said, more than he's been. I don't know what's changed. Ethan looked across the living room to where Liam was showing Ava a new chapter of the Animal Communicator book series, reading sections aloud, with the emphatic cadence of someone sharing something important. Ava was listening with her whole attention, asking questions at the right moments, her harbor-colored ring catching the lamplight. I know what changed, Ethan said. Nora Whitfield came to Boston in May. She stayed for a weekend, and Ethan had been slightly uncertain about how to handle it. The intersection of Claire's family and the life he was building after Claire was a thing, with no roadmap, no precedent anyone had handed him. But Ava had said, when he'd mentioned Nora's visit, invite her to dinner, here. Don't make it a thing by treating it like a thing. Which was, as was often the case, exactly right. Nora arrived on a Saturday evening with wine and the specific careful expression of a woman who didn't know quite what she was walking into. She found Liam in the living room immediately. He had her sister's eyes, and Nora sat down on the floor beside him and looked at his drawings for 20 minutes before dinner, and she cried quietly while doing it, which Liam handled with the gentle pragmatism of a child who had grown up understanding that adults sometimes cried, and it wasn't always something you needed to fix. At dinner, Ava was Ava. She asked Nora questions about herself, not about Claire, and she listened the way she listened to everyone, with the kind of attention that makes people feel like what they're saying has been actually received. She talked about her own work, her team, the Morrison Klein account in the beginning. She argued with Ethan about something, which made Nora laugh in surprise, and she was unapologetically entirely herself. After dinner, when Liam was in bed and Ethan was cleaning up, Nora found Ava on the back porch with a glass of wine, looking at the harbor. Nora stood beside her for a moment. She would have liked you, she said. Not as a comparison, not as a consolation, just as a truth. Ava turned to look at her. She had a way of finding people who were real, Nora said. She couldn't stand pretense. She would have recognized you. Ava didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the harbor, the same harbor she'd come to know from every angle over the past months, in every light and weather. I think about that sometimes, she said finally. She paused. Whether I'm in a space that was hers. You're not, Nora said simply. The space is different now. It's yours. She looked at the house behind them, the light coming through the kitchen window, Ethan's shadow moving behind the glass. She would have wanted this for him. I know that like I know anything. Ava nodded slowly. They stood there for a while in the comfortable quiet of two women who had arrived at the same place from very different directions, bound by a man they both loved in their separate and non-competing ways. And the harbor went on being the harbor, indifferent and constant. The wedding was in September. It was small. This was a decision they'd made in March and held to firmly against the ambient pressure of Ethan's professional world, which had opinions about what an event involving Ethan Sinclair should look like. Opinions that were delivered through intermediaries and sometimes through Derek Holt, who had developed a facial expression specifically for delivering the suggestions of people who had not been asked. Tell them, Ethan said each time, that it's a private family ceremony and that's final. Derek would nod, make the face, and go tell them. The ceremony was at a small property on the coast an hour south of Boston, a friend's place, cedar shingled and weathered, a lawn that ran down to a low cliff above the water. September on the Massachusetts coast is the specific beautiful that the rest of the year is only building toward. Clear, cold-edged, the light going amber in the afternoon, the ocean so blue it looked deliberate. 40 people. Family and the specific small category of people who are so genuinely close they've earned the distinction. Dana was there with Sophie, who wore a dress with pockets and had strong opinions about everything, including the flower arrangements. Margaret Calloway was there, in a blue dress that matched her eyes, and she cried from the moment Ava arrived until well after the ceremony and made no apology for any of it. Nora Whitfield flew in from Chicago and sat in the second row and held it together with the careful composure of someone who had made a private decision to do so. Rosalie Park was there too, at Ava's specific invitation, because the woman had made the ring and had asked the right questions, and that felt like it merited an invitation. Liam was the ring bearer. He took this responsibility with a gravity that had been building for 3 weeks and reached its peak on the morning of the wedding, when he appeared at 7 a.m. in his small dark suit with his hair actually combed for possibly the first time in his life, holding the ring box in both hands with the focused seriousness of someone transporting something irreplaceable. "Does it look okay?" he asked Ethan, meaning the suit. Ethan crouched down to look at him. His son, in a suit, hair combed, 7 years old, serious-eyed and brave. "It looks great," he said. "Mrs. Calloway fixed my tie 3 times. It shows." Liam looked at the ring box. "Dad." "Yeah. I'm glad you asked her." He said it with the directness that children have before the world teaches them to hedge their feelings. "I was worried you weren't going to for a while." Ethan looked at his son. "I was a little slow." "You were very slow. Absolutely matter of fact. But you got there." "Yeah." Ethan put his hand on Liam's shoulder. "We got there." Liam nodded, satisfied, and headed downstairs to find Margaret, who he had decided was the appropriate person to stand with during the ceremony, a decision Margaret had received with visible emotion. Ava got dressed with Dana in the upstairs room of the Cedar House, Dana doing her makeup with the focused attention of an older sister who has been waiting to do exactly this. Sophie sitting on the bed, providing intermittent commentary and eating crackers from a small bowl she'd found somewhere and claimed. The dress was not the dress of someone performing a fantasy. It was the dress of a woman who knew what she actually looked like and what actually suited her. Cream-colored, simple, the kind of dress that would look beautiful in the photographs and that she could move in, which was a requirement she'd stated from the beginning and held to. The harbor-colored ring was on her right hand for the ceremony, moved there temporarily to make room for what was coming. Dana did her makeup and then set the brushes down and looked at her sister in the mirror. "You're not nervous," Dana said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm nervous," Ava said. "You don't look nervous." "I'm nervous about the things you're nervous about at weddings. The logistics. Whether the food is going to be okay. Whether Sophie is going to say something to someone." She met Dana's eyes in the mirror. "I'm not nervous about him." Dana nodded slowly. "That's different than Mom and Dad." "I know. That's different than anything I've seen you do." Ava looked at herself in the mirror, at the dress, at her sister's hand still on her shoulders, at Sophie in the background with her bowl of crackers examining the hem of the bedspread with apparent scientific interest. "I know," she said again, softer. "It took me a while to trust that. But you do now." She thought about the waterfront at 9:30 at night, about the blue-green box and the ring that looked like the harbor, and the man who had stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes rather than wait one more day. About Liam's drawing. About breakfast and terrible bookshelf assembly and orange juice and the feeling, now deeply familiar, of solid ground. "I do now," she said. The ceremony was short, which was what they'd asked for and what they got. The officiant, a friend of Ethan's from before all of it, knew them both well enough to say true things rather than generic things, and he said them plainly, without theater. When Ethan saw her walking down the short aisle between the chairs on the lawn, he did not do the thing people say you're supposed to do. He did not compose himself. He stood there at the front with his hands clasped, his suit slightly imperfect at the collar, because he'd fixed it 3 times this morning and it had found its way back to where it wanted to be, and his face did exactly what his face does when he stops managing it. It just showed what was there. Liam was standing beside Margaret in the front row, still holding the empty ring box because he'd already delivered the ring and hadn't been sure what to do with the box and had decided to keep it. He was watching Ava walk toward his father with an expression of complete and unself-conscious satisfaction, the expression of someone whose plan has come together. Ava reached the front, stood across from Ethan. She looked at him, the specific him, not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the grieving widower, not any of the categories the world had built around him. Just the man who sat on her floor in the rain. Just the man who called at 10:30 at night about hedgehogs and Lisbon bread and stayed on the phone for an hour about nothing. Just the man who had stood on a sidewalk with a box in his pocket and said, "I'm not offering you a finished person," like that was a flaw, and not, in fact, exactly the right thing to say. She looked at him and she was not performing anything. She was just here. They said the words. Not the default words. They'd written their own, which had taken 4 drafts and 1 significant disagreement about length, which Ava had won because she'd been right that shorter was better. They said them to each other on the cliff above the September ocean in front of the 40 people who had earned the right to be there. While the light went amber around them and Sophie ate crackers in the second row and Margaret cried and Liam held an empty ring box with perfect gravity. When Ethan put the ring on her finger, the second ring now, the wedding band that sat alongside the harbor-colored stone, she felt it the way you feel things when you're not braced against them anymore. Clean and complete. Not the end of something, but the beginning of something else, which is different from endings even when it grows from them. Afterward, there was food, and the particular loosening that happens when the formal part is over and people who love each other remember how to be themselves. Margaret danced. Sophie made friends with the officiant's 8-year-old daughter, and the 2 of them disappeared for 20 minutes and reappeared with grass stains that Sophie explained by saying they'd been investigating something, which nobody pressed. Dana found Ava near the water's edge at some point in the late afternoon, the party going on behind them, the ocean going gold in the lowering light. They stood together for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, the way they'd been standing since they were children in their mother's too-small kitchen, holding things together. "You did it," Dana said. "What?" "You stopped waiting for it to fall apart." Ava looked at the ocean, at the light on it, the way it moved, the specific indifference of large bodies of water to human events, which was somehow comforting rather than diminishing. She thought about the woman she'd been on Meridian Street. Not a failure, she understood that now. She'd never been a failure. But someone who had learned so early that the floor could go out that she'd stopped walking confidently across any floor. "I'm still working on it," she said. "I know, but you did it today." She turned and found Ethan across the lawn, talking to Nora, his jacket off now, his tie slightly loosened, the specific unremarkable handsomeness of a man at ease. He caught her eye across the distance. She held up her left hand slightly, just the small gesture of showing him the ring in the afternoon light, the new ring alongside the harbor-colored stone. He smiled. Not the careful CEO smile. The real one. The one she'd first seen in the conference room when she'd said something that surprised it out of him, and that she'd been collecting ever since, all the unguarded versions of Ethan Sinclair that he only produced when he'd stopped thinking about it. She turned back to the ocean. Liam appeared at her elbow. He'd lost his jacket somewhere in the last hour, and his hair had given up on the combing. He stood beside her the way he stood beside people he trusted, just close, no announcement, like proximity was its own language. "Ava," he said. "Yeah." "Are you going to live at our house now?" "Pretty soon," she said. "In a few weeks." He thought about this. "You should bring the couch from your apartment." "Why?" "Because it's comfortable." He'd sat on it twice and had clearly developed an attachment. "Our couch is fine, but yours is better." "I'll consider it." "Sophie agrees with me." "I'll definitely consider it." He nodded, satisfied, and tucked himself slightly against her side with the unceremonious ease of a child who has decided you are his. She put her arm around his shoulders, and they stood there at the edge of the cliff above the September ocean, this boy who had set a place at the Thanksgiving table and drawn her into his plan, and held her hand on a sidewalk because it had seemed like the obvious thing to do. And she thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who didn't yet know all the ways the world could complicate things. Maybe that was the truest kind of choosing. the kind that came before the complications, the kind that made room for them rather than waiting until they were resolved. She moved into the waterfront house 3 weeks later. It was a Saturday, and Dana helped, and Liam directed the placement of every box with an authority that exceeded his years and his height, and Ethan assembled a second bookshelf with marginally better results than the last one. The couch from Charlestown did come. Liam had been right. It was more comfortable. And it went into the small sitting room off the kitchen that became, over the following months, the room where people actually sat, where Liam did his homework and Ava worked on her laptop and Ethan read, and all three of them watched things on Friday nights with the kind of low-stakes happiness that doesn't photograph well and is the actual substance of a life. The mansion, as Liam had once called it to a friend with involuntary pride, stopped feeling like a mansion. It stopped feeling like a house that had been built for a different life and was being maintained out of obligation. It became the place where the shoes piled up at the front door, and the kitchen always had too many dishes in the drying rack, and Liam's drawings accumulated on every available surface, and the couch from Charlestown sat in the sitting room with a throw blanket that Ava had brought from Meridian Street, soft and slightly worn, a thing she'd owned for years. There were hard days. Ethan had them. The grief didn't vanish. It just changed shape again, became a thing. He carried more easily and brought out less often, and on the days when it got heavy, he said, "So now instead of disappearing into the office, which was a change that had cost him something to make, and that Ava never took for granted, she had her own hard days. The waiting for the floor feeling didn't go away completely, it just came less frequently, and she'd gotten better at naming it when it arrived instead of building walls around it and calling that strength." Liam had them too. He had a phase in the winter where he asked about Claire more, directly and without warning, at dinner, in the car, once at the grocery store in front of a display of the brand of crackers Claire had apparently always bought. He asked Ava things, not just Ethan. He asked what she thought happened when people died, which was not a question Ava had an authoritative answer to, and she said so honestly, and they talked about it for a long time at the kitchen table, and she didn't wrap it up neatly because it wasn't a neat thing. Liam seemed to appreciate that. "Mrs. Okafor says people live on in what they left behind," he said. "I think that's true," Ava said. "She left behind me," he said, with the particular directness of a child stating something factual. "She really did." Ava looked at him. "And Liam, you are a remarkable thing to have left behind." He looked at her for a moment, processing this. Then, "She also left behind those crackers." "Those two?" "I don't really like them." "You don't have to." He nodded, and that was the end of that conversation, and he went back to his homework, and Ava sat there at the kitchen table thinking about what it means to love a child who is not yours and is entirely yours, and how that particular thing had no name she'd been given growing up and had taken her by complete surprise. In the spring, Ethan did something that he handled quietly and without announcement. He met with his attorneys and with the appropriate legal and financial people and made formal changes to his estate documentation, his company succession plans, and several other instruments that the attorneys described in language that was technical and that meant, in plain terms, Ava and Liam. Centered, protected, named. Not as addendums or considerations, but as the architecture of whatever came next, regardless of what that was. He told Ava about it on a Tuesday evening, not as a grand gesture. He was specifically trying not to frame it as a grand gesture, because it was just accuracy. It was just the paperwork catching up to the reality, but because she deserved to know. She was quiet for a moment after he explained it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I mean, you didn't have to do it for me too, Ava." He looked at her. "I know you didn't marry me for this. I know that. This isn't about that." He paused. This is about the fact that you are my family, you and Liam, and I want the world to reflect what's true." He held her gaze. "That's all." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Meridian Street, about the buzzer panel with the missing name labels, about the 4 years of being the most junior person in a room and knowing it and working anyway, about the woman she'd been who had looked at men like Ethan Sinclair from across the city and understood, in the simple way of someone who knows what world she lives in, that they were not the same kind of people, and that was just how it was. She thought about how wrong that version of the story had been, not because the differences weren't real. They were real. They had shaped both of them in ways that didn't simply dissolve. Ethan still occasionally didn't know what things cost, not from arrogance, but from genuine unfamiliarity. Ava still occasionally waited for things to go wrong, not from pessimism, but from an honest history. These were real things. They negotiated them, sometimes easily and sometimes not. But the version of the story where those differences were a wall, that version was wrong. The wall had always been, at least in part, a decision, and they had made a different one. She reached across and put her hand on his face, the way she did sometimes when words were insufficient or unnecessary, and he put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the kitchen of the waterfront house, while the harbor went dark outside the window, and Liam's music played faintly from upstairs. "Okay," she said, their word, still, after all of it. "Okay," he said back. On a Saturday in June, almost exactly 8 months after the wedding, Ava was working at the kitchen table when Liam came in from the backyard where he'd been kicking a soccer ball against the fence with the repetitive dedication he brought to all physical training. He was sweaty and slightly grass-stained and had that particular outdoor morning look of a child who has been entirely himself for 2 hours without adult supervision. He got a glass of water, stood at the counter drinking it, looked at Ava. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," she said without looking up from her laptop. "What do I call you?" She looked up then. He was looking at her with the seriousness he reserved for things that actually mattered, the seriousness that lived underneath the drawings and the apple juice negotiations and the strong opinions about cartoon characters. She held his gaze. "What do you want to call me?" He thought about it. "I don't know. That's why I asked." "You can call me Ava, if that's what feels right." "I know, but—" He turned the glass in his hands. "Tyler in my class, his parents got divorced and his dad remarried and he calls his stepmom Mom now. He said it just happened one day." "How does Tyler feel about that?" "He said it's good." Liam thought about this. "He said it's kind of just the word that fits." Ava put her laptop aside. She looked at this boy who had set a place at the Thanksgiving table and put her in his plan and held her hand on a sidewalk before she knew to hold his back, who had woken up at 6:53 on the morning after his father proposed because he needed to see the ring, who asked the hard questions at kitchen tables and had his mother's eyes in his father's face, and who was, in every way that she had come to understand the word, hers. "I think," she said carefully, "that you can use whatever word fits when it fits. There's no rule, no right answer." She paused. "But I want you to know, whatever you call me, you're mine. You've been mine since that bakery, honestly. Since the marshmallows." He looked at her for a moment. "8 marshmallows," he said. "8 marshmallows," she confirmed. He nodded slowly, put his glass in the sink, started back toward the door. Then, just at the threshold, casual as anything, without breaking stride. "Okay, Mom." He was back outside before she could respond. She sat at the kitchen table in the morning light and didn't try to stop it, the feeling that came up through her without permission, the specific warmth of a thing you didn't know you needed until someone walked through a door and gave it to you. She was still sitting there when Ethan came downstairs. He took one look at her face and stopped. "What happened?" "Nothing," she said. Her voice was slightly rough. "Everything's fine." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had come to his door in a rainstorm. Technically, he'd come to her door, but in some essential version of the story she had also come to his, and sat across from him in a harbor restaurant and told him that functioning was its own kind of brave, and held his son's hand on a sidewalk, and argued with him about bookshelf assembly, and made him buy orange juice and stood on a porch at midnight, looking at fireworks while his son narrated the colors. This woman who had never needed him and had chosen him anyway, which was the better thing, the thing that mattered. "Liam?" he said. She nodded once. He crossed the kitchen and sat down beside her and didn't ask anything else. Outside, through the window, Liam was kicking the soccer ball against the fence again, the regular thump of it rhythmic and continuous, the sound of a child at ease in the life around him. The harbor was blue in the morning light. The couch from Charlestown was in the sitting room. The bookshelf with the slightly warped panel held its books without complaint. This was the thing that nobody told you about when you were young and had decided that happiness was something that happened to other people. They didn't tell you that it wasn't a single moment. They didn't tell you it was a Saturday morning and coffee going cold and a kid in the yard and the person beside you not saying anything because they didn't need to. They didn't tell you it was built from ordinary days, stacked one on top of another, each one imperfect, each one chosen. That was what it was. That was all it was. That was everything.